Tonight, I'd like to invite you into a room without chandeliers, where the candles gutter, the ground is damp, and every shining myth about the Middle Ages quietly steps aside to let the hard, human truth be seen. We're going to talk about medieval battles as they actually felt to the people who lived them. The conscript jolted from a planning season by a bailiff's knock, the mercenary who has already learned how to sleep through screams, the knight who trusts in the arithmetic of steel and ransom, and the priest whose whispered absolutions travel farther than any banner in the wind. If you've been trained by movies to expect clean, choreographed duels and gallant speeches, suspend that habit for a while. What you'll hear instead is how armies were gathered by obligation more than by glory, how training was a rumour for most and a routine for very few, how the march, mud-churned, lie-spitten, dysentery-ridden, was often deadlier than the clash, and how the night before the fight could be the longest night of a man's life. We'll examine the supply chain that never quite linked, the bread that tasted of grit and made men sick even as it kept them moving, the shoes that dissolved into strips, and the improvised helmets that made a mockery of style while buying one more hour of survival. We'll think about fear as an economic force and hope as a fragile technology that had to be maintained by drums, prayers, and the discipline of not running. Along the way, we'll keep one hand on the small, unglamorous details that actually decide outcomes, the way a hedge of spears holds if the back ranks keep pushing, the way a rumour that the flank is gone can undo 1,000 good decisions, the way a standard disappearing in a knot of dust can reprice the future in an instant, the way the ground itself, when soaked by rain and people, becomes an enemy everyone must negotiate with every step. We'll ask why leaders often couldn't command so much as coordinate, why banners and horns mattered more than eloquence, and why multilingual armies moved like weather rather than like clockwork. We'll pull the camera lower, to archer fingers hardened by a lifetime of draw weight, to the angle of a bodkin point meeting links of mail, to the split second when a front-rank soldier must decide whether to brace or thrust, knowing that whichever choice he makes will ripple backward through dozens of rib cages and spines. We will not spare the senses, the smell of thousands of unwashed bodies, of wet wool that never dries, of blood turning metallic in the throat, the sound of arrows as a textured weather, first the creak, then the great collective exhale, then the hiss, the tactile knowledge transferred up a spear shaft when it meets bone, the vision narrowing during the press. When breathing becomes a negotiation with other men's armour, we'll study why routes kill more than combat, why horses are trained to be weapons and not just vehicles, and why victory sometimes looks like a field of the dead being stripped for parts while the living fight again over the same objects, only in a smaller market with worse lighting. We'll run a finger down the ledger lines of power, how ransom economics spared the armoured and doomed the poor, how church ritual built a scaffold of meaning that could carry men through horror without shattering, how justice in camp, public, swift, brutal, was always trying to hold back the chaos at the edges, how logistics, when they fail, corrode discipline, and how discipline, when it fails, makes tactics irrelevant. In short, we'll replace the theatre of swords with the business model of war, the operating system that turned fear, hunger, metal and rumour into outcomes that historians later titled as triumphs or disasters. And because battles are not only fought but remembered, we'll consider how memory edits, why paintings favour banners not blisters, why poems exalt charges not shoe rot, why the night before, the trembling, the confessions, the bargaining with God is absent from tapestries but present in every veteran's silence. Our journey will stay human scale. You will stand in a line you can't escape, Shoulder to shoulder with strangers you must trust. You will feel the weight of a weapon that suddenly seems both too heavy to lift and too light to save you. You will hear drums that promise order and screams that testify otherwise. You will watch men discover that courage is less a feeling than a behaviour you copy from a neighbour who hasn't run yet. I'll give you frameworks to listen by. Recruitment, equipment, march, camp, formation, contact, collapse, pursuit, aftermath, each a rung in the ladder that leads from harvest to history. I'll also seed a few quiet questions to keep your curiosity awake. Why did so many die before the enemy was even in sight? How did a single fallen standard turn the tide more reliably than a speech? What did the body know about fear that the mind refused to say aloud? And how did an economy of ransom, plunder, and pardons shape the ethics of who lived and who didn't? If you stay with me, we'll map famous names onto real mechanics without drowning in dates. We'll touch Crecy, Agincourt, and Towton not as distant monuments, but as case studies in mud, angle, distance, diet, and decision. We'll let the forensic facts do their soft work. Arrow densities, draw weights, wound profiles, burial pits. Then let the lived testimonies give those facts a pulse. My promise is simple. By the time the lights dim and the fan hums, you will no longer mistake cinema for history, nor cruelty for mystery. You will understand the pressures that made ordinary men into soldiers for one afternoon and ghosts for the rest of their lives. And if you're still here when the last sentence sets down its armour, you'll be ready to begin not with spectacle but with source, not with the charge, but with the causes that made charges necessary. So, breathe, settle, and lean toward the older music underneath the noise, the steady beat of logistics, the frail choir of morale, the stubborn arithmetic of terrain. And let's open this story where it deserves to open. Let's begin with the mysterious origins of medieval battles. Between Rome's fading grammar and the clear, steady handwriting of the Middle Ages stretched a long twilight in which battle relearned how to breathe, not as thunder yet, but as weather gathering patience over hedgerows and river crossings. In that gentler dusk, when borders were more rumour than line, he watches conflict take root the way hedges do, by small continuities and quiet choices repeated across seasons. Men did not meet first as painted knights, they met as neighbours with reasons, kin with unfinished reckonings, chieftains who could not afford to be misunderstood. A spear was more than iron. It was a day's labour hammered into a promise. Male links were time braided into safety, each ring a small vote for coming home. Shields, round, sensible at first, were boards of memory where family paint kept courage honest. Before gardens of heraldry bloomed, a strip of cloth on a pole could be enough to say, "We gather here." The land taught the first lessons. Ridgelines that make courage feel taller, marshes that make pride slow, fords that oblige strangers to be briefly polite. Forest paths trained patience. Open fields tempted certainty and its punishments. As the plough arranged its sentences across the earth, war kept a calendar. Plant if you mean to eat, let harvest be a truce negotiated by hunger. The church bell, metronome of village life, could summon men to prayer or to the road, and sometimes both within the hour. By torchlight, oaths rose like bridges built from breath, a lord's protection for a levy's obedience, a shoulder promised for the keeping of a name. When chronicles mention saints in lockets or splinters of the cross stitched near the heart, it is not ornament but reassurance, a steadying hand on a shaking back. Tactics grew from household wisdom, lock shields and become one animal, press forward like a tusked thought, scatter and return, as if the countryside itself were fighting with you. Horses, once couriers and witnesses, learned to be arguments. The stirrup, whether it revolutionized or merely clarified, taught riders that a body can be a lever and a lever can lift fear out of a charge. Castles rose like stern schoolmasters and changed the curriculum. Fields of battle translated into languages of siege, and patience became a weapon. Water forgot its innocence. Moats gave it new duties. Fire left the hearth for study, a thin-tongued negotiator licking at gates. Yet at heart the fighting stayed painfully domestic. The man who lifted a spear knew which furrow it had cost his wife to lose. The boy who tightened his strap could hear his mother's basin in the next room of memory. Songs rehearse the courtesies of courage, who stands where, how to answer the horn, when to keep the line still as a held breath. Arguments learn to wear armour, honour and obligation, greed dressed as justice, justice heavy with dust. He thinks of merchants tallying iron, smiths listening for the right colour in steel, the way bakers listen for a loaf's hollow truth. He thinks of monks copying treatises that mark where to plant a standard and how to teach men the discipline of not pursuing a fleeing enemy too far. The small laws that keep a day from becoming an abyss. Not every field earned a song. Ambush had its catechism. Ravines and hedges apprenticed themselves to surprise. Dawn conspired with fog. There were nights when armour felt like worry sewn into cloth, and mornings when even the bravest relearned that discretion is courage, written in a different tense. Women mastered logistics better than any captain, counting sacks, salting meat, counting again. Mules and carts composed a music of hinges and patience without which heroism would starve. Over time, colour arrived. Round shields drew long into kites, like raindrops stretched by wind, and on those painted fields, beasts and crosses bloomed, so a man could find his people when the world grew too loud. Trumpets carried grammar across confusion, drums stitched, walking into a single intention. Standard bearers practiced the quiet art of visibility without pretending to be invulnerable. If the chronicles pretend victories fit inside single afternoons, he knows better. They were built from early mornings, dry boots, mended straps, the kindness of a cobbler, the wisdom of taking a hill. The mystery is not why men fought, that belongs to every century, but how fighting learned ritual without losing danger or doubt. Perhaps the truest origin of medieval battle is less a date than a habit, turning fear into choreography so neighbours might return to neighbourliness when the hour allows. He watches a captain touch the wooden cross tied inside his glove, a levy man adjust the thong at his wrist the way he was taught in boyhood, a horse settle its ribs around a rider's breath. Somewhere a bell speaks careful syllables into the air. The sun is not yet up, but edges begin to agree about their shapes. Beyond the hedgerow, where mist tests the patience of banners, a field waits for the second lesson. Not where battles come from, but how they actually begin. He notices how a skirmish ripens into a battle, not with a roar, but with a chain of small permissions. Boots granted the courtesy of lacing before dawn, a horn allowed to speak across the hedgerow, a captain's quiet glance that turns rehearsal into memory. In hush-bright villages, the morning begins with arithmetic. Who will carry bread? Who will carry spears? Who will stay to guard what cannot be replaced? The levy answers with wholesome clutter. Farmers tucking yesterday's hands into today's gauntlets. Millers tying the same faithful knots they use for sacks. Boys practicing the posture of men their mothers have already seen inside them. Retinues arrive like punctuation, neat and practiced. Men-at-arms whose horses step through weather as if it were only another field. Squires who know where each buckle is likeliest to betray its wearer. Archers who treat the air as a ledger, each arrow an entry that must be honestly kept. The oaths that gathered them, vassal to lord, guild to town, promise to coin, do not evaporate on the road. They travel like invisible tents, reminding each man what sort of shelter honour is meant to be. And always the land, patient composer of outcomes. A hill is not theatre, it is an argument. A river is not romance, it is proof that timing dictates survival. Marsh issues its soft veto against rashness, forest teaches ambush its syllables. Commanders learn to read this grammar as shepherds read weather, and in that literacy one can glimpse how battles arrive, not from fury alone, but from treaties with terrain. Sometimes a raid unanswered fattens into a reprisal, into a mustering that will not be politely dismissed. Sometimes a wedding gift wounds a border, a tax bruises a town, a banner offends an older story that refuses to be forgotten. The church clock tries to keep all this inside the hours, tolling matins prime terse, each bell a cool hand on a racing heart. Messengers ride, parchment breathes its dry instructions, rumour gallops faster than both. By the time two hosts can see each other's colours, each has already met the other in imagination a dozen times and rehearsed a dozen ways to be brave. Tactics are household wisdom issued uniforms. Rank yourselves so courage can borrow from its neighbour. Plant your stakes before you plant your feet. If the ground is kind to wheels, let wagons pretend to be walls. If the ground refuses the horse, let the horse practice humility. He hears archers talk without speaking, knocking in a measured hush, sharing a breath with the string. He watches mounted men plot their angles, the oblique approach that turns a line into a lever, the feigned retreat that invites a lesson, the sudden hard blossom of a charge when the world narrows to the length of a lance. Historians still argue about stirrups, whether they invented courage or merely tidied it. Perhaps both are true, in the way dawn is both invention and housekeeping, light instructing shadows where to stand. He thinks of heraldry as the genderless practical art, a painted language that keeps friends findable when dust has made strangers of everyone. He thinks of the shield drawing long from round to kite, of the hauberk lengthening like a careful answer to a dangerous question, of helmets becoming quiet rooms where fear cannot echo so loudly. At the edge of the field, siegecraft clears its throat like a stern schoolmaster. Whenever castles take offence, battles learn patience. Ropes and levers do their dutiful mathematics. Miners listen to the ground as if it were a shy interlocutor. Fire writes thin-lettered petitions up the throat of a gate. Starvation becomes a policy in those stone conversations, and time, the oldest weapon, learns to wear armour called discipline. Yet for all the machinery of intention, the coming to be of battle remains heartbreakingly domestic. One man adjusts the strap that always pinches, another tucks a ribbon from home beneath his mail, where only his heart can read it. Someone remembers the cobbler's kindness and vows not to waste it. Someone murmurs an old psalm, not for victory, but for steadiness. They say a standard is raised, but he knows it is also received, a fabric asking for shoulders and finding them, a colour asking to be believed. And if you, listening with us tonight, can feel the room slowing its breath, tell me softly where you were hearing from and what hour your clock has made for you. Across streets and oceans, the same human hush meets these stories. And if this kind of journey keeps you company in the small patient hours, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so we can keep each other's lanterns lit. Now the two hosts close their distance until the space between them is exactly the size of a decision. Arrows speak first because they were taught to. They stitch the air into admonitions. Drums collect the walking into one intention. The earth seems to tighten as ranks align like books along a shelf. For an instant, a merciful, breakable instant, everything is still enough to count. Standards, breaths, possible outcomes. Somewhere a raven lifts, somewhere a child far away asks for more bread, somewhere a mother refolds a blanket so that the corners agree. And then, like a tide, the day had been holding back and finally releases. The lines move. What they make is not only danger, but meaning, the exchange by which a century decides what it will remember. In the hush, after the first impact, he is already reaching toward the next lesson, the way candlelight leans to the next page, not merely how battles begin, but how they arrange themselves along the edge of time, bead by bead, year by year, until a timeline can be held like a rosary of remembered fields. He threads a quiet timeline like river-polished stones slipped onto a cord, each field a bead, each year a breath, and lets the centuries find their rhythm beneath his palm. At first the cord is raw with doubt, an 8th century morning near Tours, where Frankish shields hold like a hedge trimmed by prayer, and riders from farther horizons discover that speed has its seasons. Later, chroniclers quarrel over whether this day saved a world or merely taught it to pace itself, and he smiles at how history prefers sturdy verbs to heroic punctuation. A few generations on, a hill called Hastings takes its patient seat, a shield wall standing like an old oak until a feigned retreat unbuttons courage, banners change languages without tantrum by residency, and an island adjusts its vowels to new rulers while bread keeps its schedule. Legnano slides next between his fingers, townsmen learning that a cart can be a creed, ox stubborn and civic, and the Holy Roman dream colliding with the geometry of pikes to discover that cities carry their own weather. Across hotter latitudes, Hatton burns its lesson into the thread, thirst playing general, smoke acting catechist, and a king, soon styled Lionheart, riding a long salt reply back across the sea. Then Bouvines, homely and decisive, proves that alliances matter more than adjectives, and that a competent afternoon can calcify into a century's habit about who belongs to whom. On another bead is carved Las Navas de Tolosa, and a narrow pass where prayer cords snap under a Spanish wind. Hills remember hoofbeats, learning a new sentence. Far east lie the harsh stones of Liegnitz and Mohi, where Europe first hears hooves from a steppe that measures distance without apology. The chronicles shrink before those horizons, and humility becomes a tactic. Yet soon comes Ein Jalut, a valley where that thunder hesitates and withdraws, reminded that even speed must bow to surprise and to the cunning of ground. The cord cools in the hand and moves on. Bannockburn, where a marsh tutors a nation in patience. Kosovo, a bead smudged with elegy, where memory wears both crown and mourning veil. Nicopolis and Varna, where crusading confidence trips on its own bright laces and learns the price of ignoring scouts. Between these darker stones, a pale one glows. Grunwald, Tannenberg to some. Forest aisles crowded with banners. Armoured vows colliding until an old order mislays its certainty in the summer heat. Now the thread enters a century of long shadows and longer boughs. Crécy teaches that a ploughed field, properly read, can become scripture. Poitiers shows how a king may be personally brave and still arithmetically defeated. Agincourt, lean, rain-slick, and measured in disciplined mud, turns narrowness into a miracle the victors recall with a shiver rather than a shout. Historians, the night gardeners of memory, still debate how much belonged to tactics and how much to luck. He thinks of luck as weather and tactics as roofs, noting that the best houses hear the rain without letting it in. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean keeps its own rosary, naval beads, where rams kiss hulls like blunt signatures, sieges where walls learn to pass the new grammar of gunpowder. Constantinople, Queen of Crossroads, receives the heaviest last beat of the medieval strand. When cannon at last speak in a new register, stones forget their ancient diplomacy, and the age changes its handwriting. Yet the thread is not merely names and dates. He rubs each bead for its human temperature. Every field has bakers who rose early for a levy, fletchers who argued with feathers until accuracy felt possible, women who converted chaos into hospitality by counting what could still be counted. Even as banners cracked in wind, children learned sums, monks repaired margins, and cobblers blessed straps with stitches that outlived their wearers. If you are listening now and the room is settling around you like a friendly cloak, tell me, softly, where in the world you are and what hour your clock has chosen. Across late kitchens and quiet bedrooms, these beads pass from palm to palm. And if this gentle keeping of time feels like a companion to your nights, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so we can share this slow, luminous craft together. He returns to the rosary and notices the pauses as much as the stones, lost campaigns that left only rumour, small border fights that trained big afternoons, truces that held just long enough to rescue harvests. He lingers over quiet victories, bridges unburned, wells left clean, a barn spared because someone remembered a name. The timeline, he realises, is less ladder than creek. It moves by eddies and patient curves, and we wade it by listening to our feet. Somewhere at the map's edge, a forgotten standard dries on a line, while an old veteran teaches a boy to fold it so the wind will not scold. Beyond them, in fields, the stars have already forgiven. The next question is uncoiling like a thin silver thread. For all we can date and count, what mysteries still hide in these battles? The missing banners, the undecided bones, the tales that never learned the proper spelling of their own names. He leans toward the margins where certainty thins, where the ink of history pales and the page itself seems to inhale. And in that hush between what is known and what must be guessed, the mysteries gather like patient dusk birds along a hedgerow. Numbers are the first to loosen their belts. The same battle swells or shrinks according to a chronicler's loyalty and weather, so that one man's 1,000 becomes another man's 10,000, and a defeat or a victory may look like miracle or bookkeeping, depending on whose parchment you trust. Names blur as the years pass. A hill called this becomes a hill called that. A ford trades its favourite shallows. A meadow sowed now with obedient wheat once wore a sharper grammar. Even the famous fields keep secrets. At Hastings, did the line truly break on a feigned retreat, or did tide courage mistake movement for invitation? At Crecy, how much was prudent design and how much an afternoon's weather tutoring English string and French nerve? At Bannockburn, the ground remembers more than men. Marsh and Burn kept their counsel while the songs chose bolder versions. He thinks of the dead, whose silence maintains a stubborn privacy, bones telling truths that words failed to carry, arrowheads making small testimonies in clay. Graves opened by careful hands, centuries later breathe puzzles. Mass burials insisting the day was harsher than chroniclers confessed. Healed fractures, revealing long apprenticeships in violence. Teeth that whisper of childhood barley fields. 100 miles from the flag, a man died beneath. Even in cities where stone files its memories more neatly, contradictions linger. Siege logs, praise engines, no one can quite reconstruct. Recipes for fire read like parables rather than chemistry. Tunnelling plans stop mid-sentence, as though the earth swallowed not only the miners, but their intentions. He imagines a sapper with his cheek to the soil, hearing timbers creak like a half-remembered hymn. Did he feel history bending to ask his name, or only the weight of the keep? Along coasts salted into tender rust, naval fights flicker behind curtains of missing paper, a sail glimpsed at dawn, a signal misread, the sudden arithmetic of oars, and then rumour where records should be. He smiles at the courtesy of heraldry and the mischief of dust, colours fading into cousins, badges borrowed by cousins, standards captured and redeployed until whole afternoons become debates about who was where. Somewhere a banner still sleeps beneath a church floor, its cloth remembering the heat of shoulders long gone. Somewhere a seal ring, lifted from a furrow, will start an argument that outlives every voice in the room. Another class of riddle coils inside ritual. What does honour weigh when grain runs thin? When does vengeance cease to be duty and become an extravagance the land cannot afford? A charter spares a town and the town burns anyway? Was it treason, miscommunication, a shift of wind? He thinks of commanders condemned for cowardice by men who never saw the ridge they refused to cross, and of commanders praised for bravery by clerks who never counted the widows a gallant charge can make. Historians, gardeners of contested soil, still dispute whether stirrups changed the world or merely clarified what men meant to do, whether bans on crossbows were piety or politics, whether miracles recorded at field altars were spiritual currency or the psychology of soldiers who could not bear for a friend's last breath to be weather only. Beneath the grand questions, the small ones refuse to retire. How many arrows can an honest day produce from the hands of a village? How far can a freighted mule walk before courtesy requires a halt? Which inn along the north road poured the stout that nursed a levy through its fear? Sometimes the earth answers with the elegance of a confession, a pit of spent quarrels by a collapsed wall, a belt buckle whose pattern matches a chronicle's boast, a horseshoe sleeping exactly where a charge was said to falter. At other times the earth prefers riddles, a scatter of coins contradicting a marching route, a set of spurs where cavalry had no business, a child's amulet tucked among soldiers as if someone slipped a last urgent prayer into the day. He remembers that survivor tales travel with the fatigue and kindness of those who tell them, making room for the friend who held the line and the enemy who praised that friend. With a final look, memory performs moral edits no map can show. And yet perhaps mystery is not failure, but furniture. The soft chairs where the past invites us to sit longer and listen. If you are hearing this in a small room where the lamp keeps a considerate circle of light, tell me softly where you are and what hour your clock has chosen tonight. Across countries and hours, we keep this company together. And if these gentle journeys feel like good companions to your evenings, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history, so our little midnight classroom can continue. He lets the questions breathe. Which standards vanished into smoke, and which slipped home, folded beneath a cloak? Which kings allowed their chronicles to weep, and which insisted their scribes stand straight? Somewhere a field lies mislabeled in the archives, its true name sleeping under the wrong calendar. Somewhere a captain's clever feint went unrecorded because the scribe fled when the sky was stitched with arrows. The mysteries do not scold, they press a finger to the lips and ask for patience. Listening, he feels a quieter certainty forming out of all this doubt, the way mist discloses a ridge. For even if details blur, there were hours when choices turned like keys in locks and altered the rooms of centuries. The night leans toward that thought, and beyond the hedges of the past, A handful of steady afternoons are waiting, those turning points where the age changed as a compass changes, a few degrees at first, then whole voyages quietly rewritten by that unseen nudge. He gathers 7 afternoons the way one might lift smooth stones from a riverbed, not because they are the only stones, but because their weight in the palm is undeniable, and he lets each one teach in its own quiet register. First, a morning near Tours in 732, where Frankish shields hold like a trimmed hedge, and a mounted tide from farther horizons breaks into spray. Whether that day saved a world, or simply taught it to pace itself, Europe learns that speed has seasons, and that infantry, braced by faith and habit, can sand the edge off even the sharpest charge. Second, a Sussex hill in 1066, Hastings, where a shield wall that had worked for generations discovers how a feigned retreat can unbutton courage. In the sag of that mistake, language is brayed, laws are ray-shelved, and an island begins to dream in a different accent, while bakers keep their schedules. Third, Hatton in 1187, hot as a catechism, thirst becomes a general, smoke a stern instructor, and the holy city's keys change hands. Chivalry, confronted by its own logistics, learns that piety without water is only the rumour of discipline, and that the geography of a day can baptise an age with new priorities. Fourth, Bouvines in 1214, homely and decisive, no single hero's poem, but a civic afternoon where alliances prove sturdier than adjectives. A king finds his footing, filing cabinets across a continent are rearranged, and the habit of who belongs to whom acquires a longer spine. Fifth, the thunder from far grass, Mohi in 1241, or, if you prefer, Liegnitz that same spring, where steppe arithmetic enters Europe without apology. Chronicles run out of adjectives, and commanders learn humility's grammar, discovering that cavalry can become geography when it moves with the sky's indifference. Sixth, Ein Jalut in 1260. An answer to that thunder, surprise and timing married to terrain, teach even the fastest storm to bow, and as the tide hesitates and turns, the world remembers that maps are not fated, but conversational. Seventh, a narrow, rain-slick page, Agincourt, 1415, where disciplined smallness becomes a miracle, written in mud and patience. Longbows rehearse their clear syllables, stakes argue against hooves, and the mathematics of a lane prove that numbers can be misled by manners. He holds these 7 and feels other stones pressing for inclusion, Las Navas de Tolosa, where chains snap across a Spanish pass, Gronwald, Tannenberg to some, where forests ask an old order to reconsider itself, and that great hinge, 1453, when Constantinople's walls discover that gunpowder has changed the alphabet of stone. He admits that turning points are partly chosen. History is always a conversation between evidence and need, but each of these days tilts habit, and habit, once tilted, quietly revises generations. For those who still argue whether stirrups, crossbows, or cannon revolutionized war, he offers a candle instead of a trumpet. Revolutions in the Middle Ages sounded less like explosions than like persistent tapping. Smiths lengthening hauberks, Fletchers trimming truer feathers, quartermasters counting twice, masons thickening the throats of gates, towns bargaining for militias that fought as neighbourhoods rather than accidents. The great afternoons matter because they trained thousands of small mornings to behave differently, and behind every hinge were hands, millers tightening belts on oxen that dragged siege timbers, women salting meat and thereby lengthening the courage of men they would never meet, monks copying a neat tactic into the cool margin of a psalter so a captain decades later could read it by winter's lamp. If you are listening now and the air in your room has settled into a quiet that feels like friendship, tell me softly where in the world you are and what time your clock has chosen. Across late kitchens and bedside lamps, these turning points turn us gently toward one another. And if this slow companionship brings you rest, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so our midnight classroom can keep its small, steady light. He lowers the 7 stones back into the stream and watches how water forgets and remembers in the same gesture. He notices what these hinges share: the domestication of fear by ritual, the education of courage by discipline, the way terrain insists on being consulted, the conversion of pride into patience. Each field teaches commanders to negotiate with weather and with the hour. Each redraws what can be asked of neighbours without breaking the village that must outlive the victory. With every turn, the cast adjusts its posture. The archer who now knows the exact distance where his craft is sovereign. The man-at-arms who distrusts lanes as much as he loves them. The engineer who hears in stone not only stubbornness, but possibility. And in that subtle re-choreography lies the next breath of the story, for the hinges would be idle without the people who leaned on them. Beyond the hedgerow of famous days, a campfire tosses a little parliament of sparks into the night. Around it sit bakers with flour on their sleeves, grooms who can calm a horse by breathing at the right speed, standard bearers practicing the art of being visible without being foolish, surgeons washing a blade while humming the psalm their mothers taught them. The field has gone quiet, but their faces hold the patient grammar of tomorrow's work, and somewhere just beyond the glow, footsteps approach. The ordinary humankind that makes every chronicle honest. The men and women whose names seldom ride alone in headlines, yet carry those headlines' weight like a well-balanced yoke. He turns from the thunder of names to the human hush that makes those afternoons possible, and walks the camp as dawn loosens its first pale thread, listening for the small biographies that keep history honest. A knight dozes upright against his saddle, not a statue of valour, but a tired craftsman of courage, his mail shirt sighing when he shifts, a river of rings sliding over leather that remembers every lesson he learned about fear. Never banish it, only teach it how to stand without ruining the room. Beside him, his squire, young, neatly worried, rehearses the day's choreography in quiet motions, testing the strap that once betrayed them, sharpening a dagger with strokes as gentle as whetstone rain, laying out laces the way a clerk lays out sentences so they will not trip across the page. Under a hedge, archers nest like a flock that speaks the language of weather. They trust their hands more than speeches, prefer the arithmetic of distance to the drama of banners. Their bow staves lean like tall, patient shepherds. Strings sleep in warm pouches because the sky has been damp, and one left-handed archer, a smudge of ink still on his thumb from last night's letter, hums a tune that keeps time with habit. He knows the names of feathers, the patience of glue, the way a field becomes a psalm if one attends the punctuation of wind. Near the wagons, teamsters and quartermasters practice the sacrament of enough oats for the horses that carry other men's decisions, enough flour to convince a levy to stay brave at noon, enough nails to persuade wheels to be faithful when a road remembers its stones. They carry no romance, only accuracy, and accuracy is how strangers return as neighbours after marching. Women pass through with a competence that makes titles feel shy. A baker peels flat loaves from an iron mouth. A healer builds her clean kingdom on a blanket. Water in one jar, vinegar in another. Linen folded the way you fold a promise. Needles boiled until they forget their former lives. She will count pulses, measure mercy by the phrase, "as much as we can," the oldest oath a camp has ever made. A farrier lifts a hoof and converses with it like a stubborn cousin. The iron he shapes is not a weapon so much as a permission, allowing the horse to carry a story without pain. Engineers talk to wood and rope and stone until materials reveal their courteous strengths. A carpenter whose thumb can tell a warp from a whim. A rope maker who teaches hemp to remember riverbanks. A mason who studies the geometry of a gate's throat with love other men reserve for their first sons. These are the souls who tutor pride and patience, translating fury into levers and pulleys, and therefore into survivable afternoons. Clergy share the morning, not only to bless, but to listen. A chaplain learns faces as carefully as a scout learns ridgelines. He keeps a small cup for oil and a smaller pocket for jokes, because even saints prefer laughter to lectures when fear sits down uninvited. Nearby, a standard bearer adjusts his pole the way a violinist adjusts a bow. He keeps the unglamorous courage of being visible, and the cloth above him is not mere colour, but navigation, a lighthouse sewn by women whose needles preached fidelity when no pulpit was near. Scouts returned smelling of hedge and brook, speaking in compass points and land-bred metaphors. The hill looks unkind today. The ford is gossiping. The lane has teeth. And messengers canter out again, their packets beating softly against their ribs like second hearts. Surgeons boil and bind and try to stay ahead of what steel will say. They keep old friendship with vinegar and thread and hold a quiet grudge against infection. That thief who knows no heraldry. Somewhere a noble frowns over a map, which is a polite lie until paired with a good pair of boots. Somewhere a common soldier tightens his belt another notch and bargains. With a loaf he hopes to meet again at dusk. The camp is not a single profession, but an orchestra that favours low instruments, cook fire and carpentry, harness and hoof, patience and remembering. Even minstrels earn their bread, not by gilding courage, but by giving men a way to breathe together. A tune cases the air, so 100 different hearts can walk through it without scraping their knuckles on each other's tempers. Children flicker at the edges, because war, like harvest, cannot banish every small life. They fetch water and learn the etiquette of quiet, discovering that heroism can look exactly like not spilling a bucket. In the shadows, the overlooked keep their republics. A washerwoman teaches linen to forget yesterday's blood. A tinker coaxes buckles to repent. A camp follower knows which words calm a mule and which words calm a man. Heralds practice the grammar of enemies, formal without foolishness, so negotiations can leave room for the living. Sentries talk softly to the dark, so the fog will remember them when it comes down with claws. If he listens closer, he hears the private bargains each heart makes. A knight promising to participate in fear without letting it decide. An archer promising not to waste a shot on pride. A quartermaster promising to count even when nobody looks. A chaplain promising to forgive before asking heaven to. A surgeon promising to keep his hands careful when the world shouts for haste. Most victories, he thinks, are sown by these promises rather than by a single loud instant. When the day grows teeth, these lives will be the enamel. When the day asks endurance, these hands will be the calendar. And when dusk returns, it will count bread more than banners, repairs more than rumours. He lingers until the faces feel familiar enough to visit again, and knows that chronicles speaking only of kings are maps without wells. The wells are here. Worn palms, clean bandages, a horse lowering its head because a groom has found the right note, and from them we draw the water that lets a century keep walking. In a little while the bell will tell the hour, and the camp will rise into its careful choreography, every craft finding its clause in the day's single sentence. But before that, in the blue narrowness just before morning, volunteers to be morning. There is a stillness that belongs to everyone, a pause with room enough for bread to warm, nerves to cool, prayers to be folded into pockets. We will return to this stillness tomorrow and follow one plain day from waking to embers, the errands, the drills, the errands disguised as drills, until night closes the ledger with a workman's hand and leaves a small, decent space at the bottom for hope. He keeps the promise he made to that blue, narrow minute before dawn, and lets one ordinary day unfold from its first careful inhale to the ember that signs its name at the end, listening as the hours speak in their own soft grammar instead of the clang of conclusions. It begins with small courtesies, learning their parts again. A kettle agrees to a quiet boil, dough turns its pale cheek toward heat, horses shake night from their manes as if shedding stale worry. Waking looks like a truce struck with yesterday. Men who grumbled now pass the ladle without keeping score. A boy who slept with his boots for bravery slips them off and rubs the ache from his feet, ashamed and relieved in the same breath. The call to gather is not a trumpet, but syntax. Instructions repeated until they become music, lines forming the way dew forms, by consent more than command. There is drill, yes, but a homely kind, a shield lifted and held until the arm learns to become a hallway instead of a wall, a bow drawn and eased so the string remembers kindness, not only strength. Horses threading poles laid like punctuation, learning where to place their commas. Practice, he realizes, is less a rehearsal of harm than an education in steadiness. The body is taught thrift, so the mind can save itself from panic's expensive waste. Mid-morning arrives disguised as errands, and therefore as strategy. Scouts leave as if late for a hedgerow appointment. Messengers ride with packets ticking softly against their ribs like second hearts. Grooms curry until sunlight pools obediently along a horse's back, a small promise kept in hair and shine. Engineers gossip with timber, building a frame that might be a bridge if friendship wins, and a mantelet if friendship does not. A carpenter taps a beam and hears its opinion. The wood replies in a dialect only patience understands. The quartermaster calls his parliament of sacks, flour, oats, salt, prudence, and measures road against appetite without theatrics, because hunger speaks every language and obeys none. A boy counts nails and returns proudly wrong. The man thanks him, then counts again. Competence, he thinks, is a sermon that does not require a pulpit. Noon asks for honesty. Bravado wilts, discipline persists. Men tilt, helm brims to sip, surprised at how kind the world sounds inside a bowl of shade. The healer goes her rounds, fingers like untying. She promises only what she can keep, and so her promises keep better than most. She has separate words for fever and fear. Her folded linen, washed into a whiteness that feels like integrity, waits for uses noble and ordinary, for sweat as well as blood. Down by the brook, where the road narrows, a chaplain tells not a sermon, but a table-setting story. A man who chose not to finish a quarrel when finishing would have cost a harvest. A woman whose patience taught a village the correct speed for forgiveness. Men listen while pretending not to, as men often do when something good is being mended in them. Afternoon lengthens and purpose puts on its boots. If movement is required, it begins with politeness to the ground, stakes placed where they belong, wagons given lanes like respected elders, banners tested to be more visible than vain, Commands arrive that are exact rather than theatrical, 10 paces, then a breath, then a turn of the wrist. An officer whose voice is famous for its quiet asks for laces to be retied and buckles to be persuaded instead of bullied. There will be hours for shouting, but this is not one. An archer tests the wind with a damp finger and decides the breeze is telling the truth. He draws without hurry and releases the way a generous host lets a guest finish a sentence. His arrow travels one prayer length farther than fear thought possible. On the left, a hawk submits to its hood again. Even hunters are students of patience today. Toward late afternoon, the day teaches endurance, the sterner lesson that scrapes romance down to its usable grain. Leather pinches the same old spot. Throats dry. A man who boasted of loving the clash longs for the domestic mercy of sitting. Courage does not depart. It makes change. One more step, one more note held, one more glance right to borrow steadiness from a neighbour's posture. He reads the kindness inside formation. Being part of a line is a kind of loan one takes out against panic at decent rates. The repayment schedule is called trust. Evening arrives with the practical tenderness of soup. Someone who could have slept chooses to cook instead. The pot remembers onions, and in that remembrance forgives everything else. Bread is broken, with the absent-minded reverence of people who know they would be smaller without one another. A boy hums, and the hum discovers it was always a song about walking, about water after dust, about mothers who fold clothes so fear cannot find them. A standard lowers, cloth, weary of wind, rests its meaning in someone's lap. Letters are written in failing light, ink that rain may blur, names grandchildren will misread, and nevertheless feel loved by the careful loops. The healer spends her last vinegar on a stubborn stain and then sits, with palms open, to let the day drain away, without spilling. Someone tells a joke so old it no longer tries to be funny, and therefore graduates into blessing. The farrier listens to iron cooling and hears tomorrow. Night tucks itself around the camp with the manners of a good guest. Sentries trade a pinch of words. The password, chosen to be ordinary, sounds like something you could say kindly to a stranger. Fires crease into embers and think in a lower register. Their thoughts are orange. A few men dream with open eyes. Roads, trust, bread. Somewhere a horse lifts its head at the remembered scent of apples. No one says, "We were heroic today." They say, "We did what the hour asked," which is the strongest sentence a century learns to write. Before sleep chooses rooms, the chaplain moves between bedrolls with the sacrament of listening. He blesses like someone wiping fog from glass, and faces briefly recognize themselves as decent. He leaves a small psalm about roofs in rain and settles near the standard. Now a folded silence. The stars, who have applauded every rehearsal and closing night since iron learned to argue, offer their undemonstrative praise. He lies back and files the day where memory keeps its useful nouns: shoe, spoon, strap, breath, friend. Beyond the last ember, the land waits, steady in its old opinions about hills and water. In the morning, it will require consultation again. And somewhere beyond that patience, at a crossroads, not yet admitted by any map, the story is already changing coats, tailored now for rites and symbols, for the way belief occupies a field and teaches courage the art of bowing without breaking. He steps into the precinct where steel lowers its voice and courage borrows grammar from altars, a quarter of the world arranged in rites and signs, meanings worn on cloth and whispered over water, gestures teaching the blood to walk in step with hope. On such mornings, dawn is a liturgy. A chaplain spreads a travelling cosmos on a blanket, cup, book, a narrow vial of oil, and the camp approaches in degrees, caps lifted, like windows unlatched to let in gentler air. Bread is blessed in the same shape. It will later be broken. Wine remembers vineyards that never asked for war yet. Like all patient things, have learned how to be useful. Some kneel with practiced ease, others with awkward tenderness. Absolution is measured not by eloquence, but by willingness. The cross a hinge sturdy enough for a trembling door. Oaths take on ceremony because promises prefer witnesses. A sword kissed and resheathed, a palm resting a moment on a gospel whose pages smell faintly of rain. A relic touched, a bone trimmed into holiness, a strip of cloth that learned a saint's sweat, and in that brief contact the mind is given a handrail. Colours keep their own congregation. The oriflamme rises like a vow learned by heart. Other banners carry beasts and lilies, keys and wheels, emblems written large so a man can read his belonging when the world grows loud. Heraldry is no ornament but a catechism for speed, distinguishing we from they without giving hatred all the lines. Shields quarter intention with crosses, surcoats spell an alphabet, gules, azure, sable, that even dust remembers to respect. Pilgrimage badges, shells, little lead saints, tin crowns, jingle into prayers with edges meant for holding. Superstition walks beside doctrine without quarrelling. A turned glove persuaded to behave, a luck ribbon tied beneath mail where only the heart can see. Horses are braided with politeness. Small bells sow a shy petition for fortune's attention. Trial by battle lingers in the memory like stern theatre, quarrel made to stand in God's weather, while priests debate theology and jurists advise caution, until the custom thins. Yet for a while the field was a courtroom, and the sky the learned judge. Even beyond formal ordeal, men thank omens without dismissing sense, birds drifting just so over a ridge, the tone of a hoof on frozen ground, the wind's sudden courtesy putting arrows in a kinder mood. Peace of God and truce of God hover at the margins, asking swords to learn the calendar of mercy, reminding warriors of fields, where wheat outranks vengeance and Sabbaths belonging to widows and to sleep. Not every ear obeys, yet more mourning softened than the chronicles admit. Along siege lines the rites acquire stone's patience. Processions circle ladders and engines, salt and water correcting timber's memory of trees and teaching it to be brave against walls. Inside besieged towns, reliquaries tour ramparts like elderly citizens blinking in sun. Shoulders learn steadiness by contact. Bells toll not only alarm but courage, bronze hands keeping tempo for spines. When famine argues, kitchens become chapels of resourcefulness. A pot that coaxes a handful of things into supper is a hymn, and grace over thin stew attains the dignity of an oath. Night has its ceremonies too. Watchwords, plain for honesty, pass like hand clasps. Last sparks are covered as though tucking children. Letters are sealed with little saints impressed in wax, cooling into the certainty that meaning may travel without losing its face. After ruin, the day is untied with accuracy, graves dug as if by carpenters, names said aloud, even guest names, so that silence does not learn bad habits. Clergy and lay hands together, square stones, place tokens, measure a psalm to the length of breath. Where time is missing, a hat tips and a promise is made to return. Later come the chantries, small economies of prayer employing the dead, candles hired to keep memory from collapsing into ash. In far monasteries, chroniclers taste ink and write with the decency of accuracy, placing miracles where courage and weather overlap and leaving a chair for doubt, humility's favourite seat. Not all symbols belong to one creed. On other horizons, hands wash in river water that remembers mountains. Cords are knotted while heaven is invoked by other names. blades are drawn with the respect owed to tools that will soon know too much, and prayers are traced in scripts whose curves resemble patient grass. Different tongues, same petition. Let me stand, let my friend live. Let tomorrow still find us capable of kindness. So, rights prevent brutality from claiming to be the only language in the room. They widen the hour so fear cannot crowd out meaning. Debates persist like careful custodians about the crossbow's morality, about whether banners unlock cruelty or discipline it, about relics needing scrutiny as well as reverence, and the arguments do not harm the faith. They keep the lamp trimmed instead of turning it into a roof, forgetting blaze. Through it all, symbols meet the quietest need, to feel accompanied. A painted beast on cloth, a bone in silver, a sentence breathed into a horse's mane. All murmur, "You are not alone." When the last blessing is given, and the final ribbon tucked, the day must still consult the older catechism. He closes the book, corks the oil, and feels the ground waiting with its stern lessons, hills with opinions, rivers with schedules, passes with narrow tempers. Beyond the circle of rights, the land spreads its patient text, and he steps toward it, ready to read where wind and water teach their slow, exact theology. He opens the oldest book a soldier ever reads, the land, and lets its pages turn in wind and weather, taking counsel from hills that have watched empires change languages without changing their slope. Terrain speaks in many polite dialects, all of them honest. A ridge is a modest pulpit, lending breath to those who stand upon it. Set men there, and their courage lengthens like evening shadow, while any foe must climb through his own heartbeat to answer. Valleys are listeners, soft-voiced and welcoming, where sound and arrow both travel kindly, yet they tighten like a throat when panic tries to leave. He watches the wise make court to ground as to an elder, asking questions before giving orders. Where will fog choose to rest? Which ditch remembers rain too fondly? What hedgerow keeps a secret? In the north, bog and moor enforce a stern etiquette, punishing straight lines, rewarding the patient foot that tests each step, turning proud cavalry into contemplative pedestrians. More than one banner has learned that glory is a fair weather word. Farther south, the earth bakes into law, a hard pan that loves hooves until it hates them, dust that misquotes orders between ranks, heat that persuades ambition to sit down and drink. Water has its own generalship. Rivers draft borders not only on maps but inside ours. Fords are appointments with fate, bridges narrow sentences where a day must choose its subject and object carefully. Some commanders befriend water, cutting dams so trickles become discipline, timing a charge to follow rain, when clay will accept a hoof only if begged, not demanded, while others underestimate a stream that widens into reconsideration, taking men and plans together into a sullen depth that educates. Forests are universities of ambush and award degrees in patience. Light breaks into measured coins there, and sight, so boastful on the plain, spends itself quickly. A dozen paces can hide a change of heart. Veterans count trunks the way accountants count debts, measuring lanes between bowls, listening to understory scratch the ankle like rumour. The best use trees as punctuation, a pause, a dash, a stop that turns a pursuing sentence into commas of confusion. Open country writes the opposite grammar. Breadth invites confidence and examines it. Wind travels without passport, and banners, for all their beauty, become tattletales pointing too clearly at gathered weight. Here logistics stand naked. Dust tells the enemy the size of your intention. Shadows betray lateness. The sun keeps its own tally of thirst. Mountains are arguments only time wins. Passes behave like guarded gates. Even the cheerful ones turn cruel when cloud lowers and stones forget their grip. He imagines the long arithmetic of pack trains threading hairpins, one slip, writing an obituary for an entire plan. Yet whoever holds the crest holds the conversation, and a handful of stubborn men can make an empire wait until the snows have issued their opinion. Coasts complicate everything with tide, the clock that refuses flattery. Estuaries push ships and soldiers into one another's classrooms. Chalked cliffs remember skirmishes and salt. Sea air turns silks into frank pennants that tell the truth about weather, whether you want it told or not. Even sieges, where stone seems to set the syllabus, come with the land's sub-clauses, bedrock refusing miners like an old magistrate, clay assisting sappers like a friendly clerk. A low swell, half a bow shot from the wall, serving as a sermon stand for engines, a crosswind stealing a fire from Greek hands and giving it to the wind's cousins. He sees engineers kneel with foreheads close to soil, hearing in its cool breath the difference between boast and possibility. Weather is the land's handwriting, legible only to those who have waited to read it. Rain thins morale as surely as it fattens streams. Frost armours ruts and makes night marches creak beneath disciplined stars. Fog smuggles whole companies across borders of sight and faith. Wind grants archers scholarships and revokes them without explanation. In all seasons, hunger edits with a red pen. Grain decides as much as kings. Valleys rich in barns can hire a week of courage, while a scorched plain demands brevity and gets it. Towns are terrain too, stone made social. A market square is a bowl that can warm or trap. Alleys write footnotes only locals can read. Gates have moods and hinges with favourite arguments. Wells are sovereigns, and whoever courts them well finds his voice carrying further. Villagers tilt a day with mill races and hidden ladders by misplacing the very idea of a clean lane. Even rumour has geography. Heights repeat it loudly, marshes swallow it, monasteries copy it with improved spelling and uncertain tone. If chronicles make it seem that commanders moved men as easily as quills, the land's marginalia say otherwise. A captain hesitates because a field smells wrong. A farrier taps a stone and hears iron will be needed. A scout returns with mud arranging its case about where weight belongs. From afar, choices look linear. Up close, they sound like conversations with hedges. Yet the land is not an enemy. It rewards manners. Armies that consult it early are granted shortcuts. Those that belittle it are sent to detention among thorns. The best generals are translators, taking hill and river into their ear and speaking to men in a vocabulary of angles, pauses and shade. On the smallest scale, every soldier practices this diplomacy, setting a foot where the tuft will forgive, leaning a shield so wind befriends it or leaves it alone, drawing water where mud will not sulk. He remembers long campaigns whose truest victories were wooden, bridges repaired before metaphor could steal them, causeways taught to float a little longer, culverts coaxed into honest labour, and short campaigns whose defeats were pebbles, a stone in a boot, turning bravery into policy, a blister insisting on promotion. Landscape is not backdrop, but partner, a stern co-author who edits generously when respected and savagely when ignored. Night gathers while he orders these thoughts, and the fields compose their own soft counsel, the hedgerow unruffling, the stream forgiving footprints, the ridge settling a new silence like a shawl. Tomorrow the ground will be asked to arbitrate alliances and feuds, to hear the cases banners bring into its court. Already, beyond the last fence, riders parley with the dark. Voices travel like thin ropes between camps, tugging at possibility. The earth older than all bargains listens, and somewhere beneath patient stars, a path bends toward a tent where hands will be offered or refused, and two maps, meeting edge to edge, will learn how to overlap. He steps into the chamber where war dresses in velvet and learns the patient diction of politics, where conflicts braid themselves to alliances, where oaths splice neatly into expedients and banners consent to share a table, as if colours could be persuaded to drink from the same cup. Here steel is only one negotiator among many, and parchment carries its own kind of teeth. He watches feuds ripen like weather systems and spend themselves in a sudden rain named treaty. Sworn enemies wake to find they are provisional brothers-in-law, because a marriage invented a bridge that did not exist at dawn. Count and bishop, king and commune, order and emir, each takes a turn in this quiet theatre, where power changes posture by inches. A truce is more than the absence of fighting. It is a courteous clock. It lets harvest proceed, allows churches to bury the year's debt, invites widowers to become husbands again. But truces startle easily like shy animals, one raid too deep, one insult too carefully polished. And the peace that had begun to walk returns to its den. Papal legates arrive with rings bright as small suns, reminding princes that heaven keeps a filing system. Sometimes the rings persuade, sometimes they merely record the tragedy of stubbornness. Emperors send eagles across the Alps and learn that Italian city-states prefer to be courted rather than commanded. Communes answer with the leagues, Lombard today, Tuscan tomorrow, politely demonstrating that a cart drawn by neighbours can jolt a crown off balance. Condottieri sell competence like careful apothecaries sell powders. By weight and reputation, they fly between patrons as swallows fly between eaves, and towns learn to read contracts with the attentiveness once reserved for scripture. Farther north, the Hanse keeps its peace by ledger. Herring and timber, fur and salt, drafting treaties that boats obey better than armies. A city that commands its key acquires a vocabulary of no that even kings must respect. Along river frontiers, margraves practice the art of threshold, opening and closing as circumstances require, their banners behaving like shutters, half daylight, half defence. In the east, princes weigh homage to a distant Khan against nearer alliances, and letters ride for weeks with the humility of grain sacks, asking for arrangements the wind will not mock. On the Atlantic rim, stubborn dukes trade arrows in one season and daughters in the next. A spray of islands survives by sharing cousins. Even crusader lords, who arrived with hot ideas about the purity of enmity, learn the mathematics of water and siege, bargaining with neighbours whose prayers face other horizons to assemble afternoons that are almost reasonable, until rumour fattens an accident into a quarrel and the scorpion tail of betrayal flicks. Warfare in this age has a sleepless twin, diplomacy. Hostages live as living commas between clauses, growing fluent in the grammar of hesitation. Envoys memorize distances the way archers memorize ranges, knowing which duke thinks best at matins and which queen prefers promises in velvet rather than iron. Coin works its quiet sabotage throughout, debased here, clipped there, or, best of all, kept honest so trust accrues in invisible accounts. Alliances creak like ships when too many passengers want the window. Some are braided by faith, the peace and truce of God scheduling mercy into the weak, others by fear. When petty lords kneel together rather than separately before the same large shadow, border castles pass from hand to hand like stern heirlooms, their stone mortared with inherited grudges. Chanceries perfect the soft weapon of precedent. produce one charter old enough, and the present blinks, produce two, and it begins to negotiate with ghosts. Dynasties behave like rivers, forking and rejoining, disappearing into limestone only to surface green miles away. An heiress becomes the hinge on which counties swing. A child's marriage redraws a map that soldiers will spend 10 years learning by boot. Yet amid this velvet arithmetic, there is sincerity. Rebels kneel when terms honour their labour. Kings relent when the price of anger is a winter without bread. He watches a council where hawks and doves sit at the same table because both keep farms in their heads. One speaks of honour, the other of grain, and the decision respects both by choosing an advance as narrow as a lane and brief as a prayer. Some alliances are made with saints. Cities vote themselves patrons and expect weather and luck to feel morally obliged. Others with engineers. Keep the bridge and we will keep the road, says the town, and the Lord nods, because bridges are better than sieges. The Swiss teach Europe that virtue can be geometry, pikes like hard snowdrifts denying horse and habit alike. The English and French conduct their long argument as if two calendars were quarrelling, chevauchés burning grammar into fields while truces arrive to let those fields practice forgetting. In the borders, marchers and moss troopers live by a code that resembles neighbourliness up close. They raid with courtesy, exchange prisoners with a touch of theatre, and bequeath to their children grudges small enough to fold into songs. Every power shift looks inevitable only after it finishes shifting. While it moves, it resembles market day, crowded, contradictory, alive with barter. A queen's patience delays a war by harvest. A bishop's refusal to bless changes a campaign's verb from must to might. When agreements harden into seals and seals into years, people adjust quietly. A village learns a new lord's gait by the way his horse approaches. A town tallies its taxes and discovers that fairness is a dialect. Even tyranny must sometimes pretend to speak. And from beyond the canvas walls of this bargaining room drifts a sound no treaty can silence. The measured clink of ladles on kettles, the counting of sacks, the ringing of hooves. Alliances may tilt a day, but logistics decides how long the tilt can last. He turns toward that steadier music, the commerce of survival, the markets that hire courage, the resources that tutor ambition in limits, and lamplight catches the edge of a coin, as if a small moon had volunteered to guide the way. He follows the small moon of a coin into the quieter engine room of war, where markets whisper the terms on which courage may operate, and roads carry not only men, but the arithmetic that keeps them useful. Armies are described in bright nouns, knights, banners, kings, but their verbs are purchased by sacks, grain measured in patient scoops, salt stacked in shy pyramids, promising endurance, barrels of ale coaxed across ruts, so a levy's nerves can find a polite place to sit. Caravans begin their labour long before the first trumpet bothers the morning. Drovers and merchants trace paths older than feuds, the strings of their carts tugging like thoughtful verses through hedgerows and along rivers. Ports take their turn as quartermasters, fish salted into coins of stamina, timber lashed into masts that teach steel and wool to travel in the same sentence. Fairs swell like lungs, filling sheds with iron and linen. Hauberks change hands with the seriousness of tools. Spearheads are bought from smiths who sell listening as much as metal. In monastic barns, tithes become strategy. An abbot, who knows the parish's appetite as closely as a captain, knows a line decides whether to lend barley to a lord whose temper runs on its own calendar. Town councils, civilian chanceries of survival, debate how many carts a week may be spared without teaching winter a bad habit. Coin keeps story and discipline honest. A realm that clips its silver finds its soldiers clipped of patience, a realm that pays cleanly, discovers men can be persuaded to stand in places fear would otherwise forbid. Purveyance, the crown's right to buy at a price it calls fair, walks a narrow lane between justice and resentment. Done with courtesy, it rescues a campaign. Done with greed, it becomes a rebellion, rehearsing its grievances. Merchants read armies, like weather. Some take the road early, skirting thunder. Others ride behind the noise, selling comfort to the exhausted in terms that feel like mercy. Guilds sustain the invisible edge. Fletchers bargain for feathers of particular honesty. Bowyers coax you into crescents with the patience of abbots correcting novices. Armourers nurse rivets like gardeners tending roses, each tiny discipline a chance to prevent later grief. Even the tannery, frank with its perfumes, interns for logistics, straps that won't sulk in rain, scabbards tolerant of dust, saddles that remember kindness when a day forgets. Minds breathe their dark arithmetic. Tin out of Cornwall, iron from the Weald or the Harz, silver from Bohemia or the Tyrol, rising like buried stars into economies that ask them to shine as coins, as kettles, as mail. Above ground forests pay out their annuity in boards and boughs, an inheritance the wise do not squander. Waterways remain elder. Accountants? Barges move more justice than roads can manage, their slow geometry turning a single ox into many men. The unromantic brilliance of staple ports, of fish quotas and wool customs, looks like parchment until one notices how many afternoons of steadiness they buy. Wool, quiet monarch of northern fortunes, underwrites garrisons and marriage portions alike. A sheep plague can silence a drum. In the south, olive and wine keep their own ledgers, greasing negotiations and lamps, feeding bodies and treaties in the same dip of the cup. Sieges bend entire economies into new shapes. A threatened town becomes a hive of thrift, wells bricked like psalms, cisterns taught restraint, gardens parcelled into syllables of green. Bakers stretch flour with courtesy rather than deceit. Cobblers reclaim leather from histories it no longer needs. Women organise the Republic of Boiling, turning whatever can be coaxed into sustenance into a vote for another day of hope. Outside besiegers count firewood as carefully as arrows, learning that patience burns fuel faster than bravery. Timber for engines must arrive on time, or not at all. Rope must be persuaded with tar and prayer. Nails, the punctuation of reality, must be both numerous and honest. Victory often belongs to whoever packed the better spoon. Mercy runs on a budget as well. Ransoms circulate like responsible weather, turning enemies into future correspondents. A captain who keeps his word about prisoners finds creditors where a rougher man would find only grudges. The chantry economy, the hiring of prayer, lingers after the noise is gone, employing singers and wax so memory neither spoils nor starves. Toll gates and bridges annotate campaigns in their margins. A duke who holds a crossing charges for delay. A commune that maintains a bridge earns consultation rights from geography itself. Markets reopen after battle the way a chest reopens after breath has been knocked out of it. Carefully, stubbornly, with a hand on the rib that hurts. Children count coins left in their mothers' purses, and those counts become unheralded referendums on whether a prince was wise. In a mule's hoof he hears a macrocosm. Iron requires farriers, farriers require charcoal, charcoal requires coppice, coppice requires tenure, tenure requires law, law requires trust. Break one link and courage limps. Keep them conversing, and courage can afford to be kind. Religion, law, and commerce meet at crossroads to vote on whether this week belongs to swords or to ploughs. When their ballots rhyme, peace becomes cheaper than war, and even proud men learn thrift. Where currencies quarrel along frontiers, barter returns with its old courtesies: cheese for nails, linen for salt, a promise for a sack of oats, and enemies remember they are also neighbours. Rumours of crusade or chevauchée puff prices like bellows. The shrewd ask what winter thinks of summer's boasting. A prudent captain courts millers as well as lords, carters as well as bishops. He keeps his pay chest fuller than his rhetoric, and discovers that desertion is as economic as it is moral. At dusk a quartermaster closes his ledger, pages smelling faintly of grease and rain. He touches each column like beads and nods. A day funded, not merely fought. The small moon of coin has led him through a sky of unglamorous stars. Oats, nails, vinegar, thread, and now another constellation resolves how these resources clothe themselves in matter, becoming tools and garments and dwellings, how a culture's hands teach wool and wood and iron to speak the visible manners of its war. Somewhere a smith's fire lowers its eyelids, a loom quiets, a mason rests a palm on cooling stone, and in that tender hush the age's material grammar waits, patient as cloth on a table to be read. He steps into the workshop of the age where resources become manners, where wool learns patience on the loom, where iron accepts purpose, where stone acquires a memory, and watches how material culture turns a quarrel into a grammar people can carry. Cloth speaks first, because warmth is older than victory. In cottages and town rooms, spindles purr like small cats. Thread goes walking toward looms, where warp and weft negotiate their civility, and from that quiet congress come hoes that do not sulk at rain, gambesons quilted like thoughtful snow, cloaks whose corners remember the discipline of wind. Colours arrive by herb and dye stuff, woad's serious blue, madder's sober red, weld's honest yellow. Weather fixed into fibre so a levy may remain legible to itself when dust pretends to be fog. Over such cloth, leather keeps its kind promises: belts that do not panic when tugged, gloves that teach tools to feel at home in hands, boots that convert miles into something a body can afford. Then iron clears its throat, less noise than clarity. In forges that smell of discipline and charcoal, smiths listen for the note a bar should sing, and stretch that note into mail, a river of rings, coaxing edges to think twice, and into plates, calm arguments hammered to agree with ribs and shoulder blades the way respect agrees with a name. Rivets punctuate survival. Greaves and vambraces accept their offices without show. The helmet, salet, bassinet, kettle hat becomes a small, well-governed room where fear's echo loses its edge. Edges themselves, swords and bills, glaives and falchions, are negotiations in steel, hardness invited to sit with flexibility until both agree to serve. A peasant's billhook, promoted, learns battle's manners. A knight's sword, chastened by repair, remembers prestige is only useful when it can be resharpened. The bow returns, quiet, sovereign, its stave chosen from yew that studied for decades at the slow University of Weather. Elsewhere horn and sinew compose a different persuasive curve. Fletchers argue with feathers until the air consents. Heads, bodkin or broad, decide whether to ask a question of mail or of unarmoured haste. Crossbows kneel into the crank's ritual, brutally practical and therefore endlessly debated. Their bolts are short, accurate sentences. Beside weapons stand tools whose virtues make war survivable. Shovels that move more policy than parliaments. Adzes that teach timbers to cooperate. Augers that persuade wood into joining without complaint. With these, engineers build mantelets like walking hedges, hoardings like wooden eyelids for walls, rams whose blunt grammar convinces Gates to reconsider. Rope, hemp, raised with river patience, becomes the unshowy sentence binding all this into sense. Pins and wedges, small citizens, keep their promises without applause. Architecture gathers these crafts into stone that owns both duty and grace. In peace, masons give parishes ribs of light, tracery proving that strength and delicacy can share a roof. In war, the same hands teach towers the habit of watchfulness, curtain walls the habit of depth, gate houses the etiquette of suspicion. Portcullis teeth meeting like a measured bite. Murder holes maintaining a cool, disagreeable rain. Arrow slits write long, thin thoughts into air. Machicolations give gravity, a job on short notice. Later, when powder finds its bass notes, bastions lower their pride and widen their stance like wrestlers who prefer leverage to height. Lime kilns smoke somewhere just out of sight, translating chalk into the glue of whole afternoons. Inside these precincts, matter permits mercies. Cauldrons remember onions and rescue morale. Barrels hold ale so nerves may sit. Trestles fold, wagons yoke. Harness distributes strain according to fairness learned from horses. Needles stitch rent mail to Gambeson and rent Gambeson back to duty. Wax linen thread behaves nobly under pressure. Lanterns cultivate little moons for maps to think by. Wax seals let letters carry authority across weather. Even pegs and wedges earn footnotes in the chronicle of survival. With the surgeons, matter meets flesh with awkward tenderness. Bone needles, bronze scissors, iron knives honed to a kindness, along with vinegar's honesty and linen's cleanliness, make it possible to stitch a future to a present without too much scolding. Splints speak the grammar of straightness. Cautery is a last resort that prefers not to be needed. Salves carry leaf and lard in proportions monks learned by listening to fields. Around the edges, craft keeps its festivals. Guild halls painted with the arms of those who make mornings possible. Apprenticeships binding generations in slow oaths that outlive quarrels. A town's pride resides not only in its walls but in the manners of its hinges. A village's security is measured by the cooper's success in coaxing staves to obedience. Fine things walk the boundary between use and meaning. Embossed scabbards, pommels whispering nielloed stories, saddlecloths patiently embroidered, reminders that people are not merely instruments of their instruments, and that material grace teaches endurance to remain human. Culture and kit conspire to keep kindness available. A blanket shared because wool was plentiful this year, a cup passed because tinsmiths did their work, a letter home because ink and quill survived the march. Even banners owe their eloquence to looms, dyers, stitches. The wind cannot read allegiance unless women's hands first spell it. Beneath the clangors and chores runs the metaphysics of upkeep. The world collaborates with intention when asked politely and maintained with oil. A drop on a hinge is a philosophy, a sharpened spade the ethics of tomorrow's trench, a well-built bridge a treaty with rain. When night visits and tools hang like sleeping sentences, he feels how this grammar of things has argued all along for a civilization durable enough to host mercy. On such shelves, the next day's character waits, coifs folded like patient clouds, arrows nested like careful thoughts, stones stacked where they will remember what straightness means. And beyond those shelves, another chamber begins to stir. The house of myths and legends living among these objects, naming and charming them, teaching men to imagine courage before they must spend it. He steps into the house where facts wear cloaks and names learn music, the chamber of myths and their patient variants, where battle comes home cleaned and combed and carrying lessons bigger than any single noon could hold. In this softer light, the old companions are waiting. A horn that swears it was sounded on time, though breath lagged, a sword that insists it once drank sunlight and therefore could not break, a standard that remembers standing when knees did not. He lets them speak, for singers who stitched afternoons into epics knew that courage travels better in verse. Roland takes his place on a Pyrenean pass and raises the Oliphant until stone itself seems to listen. Historians thumb the ledgers and argue whether the horn blew too late, but the chanson chooses a different audit. Beware the pride that mistakes steadfastness for silence. Across the table, Arthur's court arranges chivalry like a constellation to steer by on muddy roads. Scholars point out that the king's century does not match his cup, and that French poets loaned English hills their manners, yet listeners anywhere feel steadier, knowing that somewhere a round table keeps its chairs equal. Charlemagne's mantle grows obligingly wide in these rooms, appearing at sieges he never saw, yet his ghost proves useful to masons in need of patronage, and to clerks who require a name under which to file order. Sagas arrive salt-haired and unsentimental. At Stamford Bridge, a Norse axeman holds a lane so fiercely his name becomes unnecessary, and at Maldon, an old poet keeps the grammar of loyalty and its costly grace. Later, glossers wonder whether a leader's courtesy wandered into folly, but the poem preserves the courtesy so farmers may rehearse fidelity under weather. El Cid rides in with double registers, mercenary and husband, exile and neighbour. Some songs make him sleeping steel that wakes when a banner asks. Others show him counting coins carefully so oaths can keep their shoes. Both accounts are true, the way a window is true from inside and out. Crusader legends stand nearby with hems singed by Levantine's sun. St. George visits sieges as if dragons merely changed species. St. James rides as Matamoros when Castilian hills want a verb as bright as hooves. Sober hands in the margin remind us that visions wear local clothing and that saints are recruited by civic need as much as by heaven's calendar, yet the moral usually keeps neighbourly hours, stand, endure, forgive later. Even Saladin acquires a near holiness in the Western telling, his courtesy serving as a mirror in which Christians may examine themselves without bruising. The oriflamme glows, and men swear it held the day the way a good hand holds back panic. Archivists, drier of tone, confess they cannot always put the banner on the right ridge. The Holy Lance ebbs and returns like a tide. When a visionary at Antioch declared he had found it, hunger briefly learned hope's accent. Inquiry cooled the tale, but the hard truth remains that starving men stood afterward. Nearer to mud and bread, humbler charms proliferate like sensible weeds. An archer murmurs a verse to teach his arm patience. A mother stitches a psalm along a surcoat's hem where only fatigue will read it. A knight carries a pebble from his home well and claims it has opinions about fear. Miners say the earth hums warnings if you put your cheek to it. Sailors keep a Candlemas scrap of sail that the wind agrees to recognise. Somewhere a herald whispers that ravens are only birds, and somewhere a levy man answers that birds are also tutors. Watch how they rise when something is wrong. Between grand legends and these pocket-sized ones, a slow grammar takes shape. Courage is a borrowed flame, and stories are how matches stay dry. Even quarrels about crossbows grow their own myth. Popes frowning, princes winking, confessors advising careful aim against plate but not against peasants. Modern readers debate statute and practicality, while ballads simply ask the quarrel to fly straight and come home as bread. The longbow stretches taller in memory than in hedgerows. Some chronicles boast ranges that make the wind smile, and we nod because the parable matters more than the yardage. A village training together is virtue, whether arrows reach miracles or merely duty. Saints at Bannockburn, and angels at Montjoie, the hand of God at this ford, and the witch who allegedly spoiled that banner. Every region tends its plot of brighter claims, and at the edge of respectability, a relic cellar offers splinters that smell too recently of carpentry, yet even false relics feed true hunger. Because people wish to feel accompanied and to believe fields are not empty when the hour asks too much, most variants, handled with patience, are not lies but lenses. They bend the light so a day's intention stays visible to the next generation. A monk exaggerates so a child will sit up and listen. A captain understates so grief can fit inside a hearth. Historians, gardeners of exactness, prune exuberance. Storytellers graft courage where it will take. The tree grows truer by both labours. Enemies borrow one another's reputations as tailors borrow patterns. A courteous foe becomes the yardstick for one's manners. An obdurate hill is promoted to a mountain so the steepness of victory can be morally proportional, and when a tale grows too sharp, another is told beside it to sand the edge. The counter-legend that returns humanity to those distant had turned into monsters. In this house of stories, the listener learns a small practical mercy. Memory needs art, as bread needs salt. Without it, remembrance goes stale. With too much it thirsts. He lingers over a small myth of his own, a soldier who kept a tiny icon stitched into his cap and swore it made arrows curious rather than cruel. Later the cap is found in a ditch and the icon is gone. But violets have decided to exist there, and the chronicler writes it all down because the heart keeps both ledgers. This room could continue forever. Humans are tireless makers of meaning. But myth does not float above ground. It springs from the crafts and knowledges that keep a day standing. Beneath any banner that wins a stanza are hands that know weather, routes, herbs, and thrift, indigenous wisdoms of farm and forest, of shore and steppe, that teach survival long before any trumpet teaches attack. He turns toward those quieter tutors now, the shepherd reading cloud-like scripture, the fisher sounding a river with pole and memory, the hedge witch arguing infection into retreat with water, honey, and time. Beyond the doorway where polished shields hang, a path curls into fields that whisper instructions older than legend, and he follows, listening for the practical secrets that kept neighbours alive long enough to inherit the stories at all. He steps into the commons, where wisdom travels without banners, passed in the cupped hands of neighbours, traded like seed at a fence, sung into the memory of children who do not yet know they're learning, and finds that survival has always kept the finest library in fields and kitchens. Dawn here speaks a dialect of chores that double as algorithms. The shepherd reads cloud height and the shy mathematics of flock and slope, gauging from the sheep's favourite hill the speed of rain and whether the ford will argue by noon. A farmer kneels to the soil as to scripture, lifts a pinch to breathe its damp syllables, and knows when to trust the plough and when to let the ground rest, when to braid rye with legumes so hunger forgets the address, when to invite geese so the grass tells a calmer tale. 3-field rotation is not theory, but courtesy offered to earth, winter grain, spring sowing, fallow like a Sabbath, lending the land a chair so it can sit and return kindness. Hedgerows host a quiet guild of foragers who keep the parish literate in seasons, sloes after the first frost, hazelnuts before the wind grows opinionated, mushrooms only where the trees are known by name. They carry rules like rosaries. Do not pluck what you cannot name. Always leave enough for the next mouth. Laws older than any town hall quarrel. Salt writes its own scripture. Fishers taste tides with a finger to the wind and cure their catch as if persuading time to be gracious. Inland, butchers turn meat into ration. By faith in smoke and patience, vinegar keeps its calm republican crocks. Honey draws its boundaries and forbids rot the vote. A house that knows pickling can afford bravery in winter. A town that knows salting can afford mercy at its gate. The kitchen is a laboratory pretending to be domestic. Women run the republic of boiling, and the principality of cooling calibrate porridge like policy, thin when scarcity visits, thicker when rumour threatens to become fear. Add nettle or leek, not for garnish, but for cells that need instruction. By the hearth a small pharmacopoeia awaits, honey that coaxes wounds to remember wholeness, garlic that argues sharply with infection, yarrow negotiating treaties with bleeding. A hedge witch, wanted in secret and denied in public, keeps recipes in her head because paper is too proud. She shows a mother willow for fevers, comfrey for impatient bones, time, sis, and steam for chests that have forgotten the door. Monks in colder script agree, pressing herbs into margins God will read. Between psalms they record that boiled linen and clean hands are a theology saving more lives than thunder. Water, the old negotiator, is courted with wells lined like careful thought and cisterns drilled in the habit of restraint. A miller, half engineer, half diplomat, listens to a stream's insistence and coaxes it into turning bread from grain. He knows when to lift a sluice so flood will not confiscate a harvest. Hears in the pitch of bearings a policy change arriving. Fire is tutored. Tinder learns the gentle progress from spark to ember, and the child who can do it with damp fingers inherits a kind of citizenship. Charcoal burners keep their domes breathing like tame animals so the smith may persuade iron to admit its inner grammar. In the forest, tracking is a syllabary written in hooves and pads, a twig that still smells alive where it broke, dew smudged by a flank, droppings that confess the hour. Hunters read without theatre, share venison with widows, praise the deer whose life became a winter's permission. Across coasts and highlands, navigators keep pocket astrolabes made of habit rather than brass, the taste of wind along a tongue born to the sea, the song a harbour sings when sandbars shift, the way stars arrange encouragement on a familiar latitude. Roads, even hostile ones, can be negotiated by craft. Chalk marks that only allies can read at dawn, hedge knots tied to look like carelessness but carrying a map. Bells rung in patterns that mean guest or wolf or borrow a cart quietly. Villages maintain signal systems that leave no fingerprints on the law, a ribbon on a post to warn that soldiers walk the western lane, a pot turned mouth down to say the news is bad but children are safe, 3 chimes after curfew to request a midwife without panic. Livestock have tutors as well as owners. Farriers converse with frogs and hooves until lameness admits its reasons. Shepherds school foot rot with astringent baths and stories. Cowmen time carving with the moon, not from superstition, but from the moon's calendar of tides inside bodies. Barns are built with the humility of knowledge, doors set to lee, lofts designed so mice learn manners, beams pegged, so wind may pass without riding its anger into the frame. Risk itself is a craft. Hamlets spread granaries like insurance so a single fire cannot bully a year. Families treat debt as neighbourliness rather than punishment, trading tasks like currency that accrues interest in goodwill. When riders come, taxmen, levies, rumour, women negotiate invisibility with the house. Loaves cooling are, for the sick, the rope coils, as if it never tied urgency. A child with a quick mind harvests silence. Wayfinding belongs to more than roads. A sergeant finds his way out of fear by trusting small tasks. Sharpen, fold, count, breathe. A levy husband finds his way back to tenderness by checking a piglet's ear for burrs, by mending a hinge so it will not raise its voice. These are not sentimentalities, but return paths from the edge where danger drafts its narrative. At the borders, where cultures meet, fairs, hospices, ferries, knowledges barter their modest brilliance. A Moor shows a mason that lime slakes better when sung to. A Finn whittles a sledge runner and whispers to an Italian that snow is honest water with opinions. A Jewish physician explains to a knight that wine is joy and medicine if one keeps a promise to temperance. The exchange is older than argument. Not every parish keeps every rite of prudence. Some neglect wells, some mock hedges, some gamble with winter and lose. But the large habit of survival remains reverent without drama, making it possible for wars to end because villages are still there when armies remember their manners. These quiet strategies are not a footnote to battle, but its elder sibling, giving warriors a home to fight for and a doorway to return through without shame. Night gathers and the commons murmurs, bees settling, a bucket letting down its handle, a door choosing to fit its frame, and in that murmur a new horizon brightens. For roads widened, and caravans, crusades, marriages, and merchants braided far parishes into one another's days. Soon we will step to the thresholds where such districts met the wider world, and watch how exchange, conquest, curiosity, and courtesy taught medieval battle to adopt foreign tools and learn new dialects. He walks to the thresholds where parishes soften into roads, and roads relax into horizons, and watches how the age learns to hold a conversation with distance, how encounters, as unlike as trade and conquest, pilgrimage and piracy, teach battles to change their accent without losing their grammar. At the ports, masts gossip like reeds in a tideline wind. Along the quays, wool meets silk, salt meets spice, and coin practices new faces until trust understands them. In Genoa, a crossbow is bargained into a crate and sent riding a hull that has borrowed the Latine's triangular patience from southern seas. Farther north, the bluff-bowed cog brings its honest appetite for weather, and between these temperaments sailors invent a tactics that makes the wind a partner rather than a rumour. Over the Rhone and across the Brenner, caravans carry not only pepper and saffron, but stories about engines that throw stones by mathematics and powders that can persuade fire to do metal's work without bellows. Gunpowder travels first as a smell, then as a syllabus. Monasteries lift an eyebrow, princes lift purses, and soon the dialogue between wall and cannon modulates into a new key. Eastward, the hooves of the steppe arrive like sentences written without punctuation, swift, continuous, convincingly simple, and Europe, which had believed cavalry a matter of pride alone, learns that speed can be a theology. Liegnitz and Mohi deliver the severe lesson. Ein Jalut offers the local reply of water, ambush, timing, and nerve. Composite bows, horn and sinew married by patient glue. Ask armour to use humbler verbs. Mail lengthens, plates begin to overlap like fish, and certain shields quietly retire from conversations they no longer dominate. In the south, Iberia's braided history ripens into a portfolio of movement. Berber hills teach lightness, Castilian plains teach shock, and along the peninsula's rim, oar and sail discover they are dialects of the same maritime language when the coxswain is courteous. Greek walls tell Latin ears what patience sounds like. Latin engines answer in carpentered prose. Knights riding east with hot ideas about purity of enmity discover their neighbour's domestic genius. Irrigation that turns siege into arithmetic. Markets that keep courage employed. Truces disciplined by the calendar of olives. Gratitude, disguised as practicality, copies what it can. Numerals that make pay chests legible. Glass that serves both eye and lamp. Recipes that keep wounds honest. and men humbler. In Levantine air, banners of many prayers share the same wind. Enemies trade water like grammar, essential, easily misunderstood. A crusader who once believed holiness was a colour begins to recognise it in the shade of an awning where a stranger offers a cup. The Catalan company, hard, hungry, competent, sells its ferocity to Byzantium, then writes a brisk, booted footnote across the Aegean. Swiss pikes, neat as winter fences, descend into Italian sunshine and find condottieri who prefer contracts to oaths. Under ink, courage still manages to behave. Hostages act as living commas between clauses and return home as couriers of custom. A boy given as surety grows fluent in a rival's appetite for mercy and brings the recipe back like a secret he intends to spend kindly. Merchants, secular pilgrims with strong ledgers, map the physics of endurance. Their pages teach captains to price pursuit against the profit of restraint. Churches multiply doorways for this traffic. Cistercian barns turn hill counties into steady paymasters. Templar houses, before they fall, serve as polite fortresses of exchange. Hospices along pilgrim lanes make beds into treaties and bread into a temporary citizenship. Even outlawry acquires foreign grammar. Letters of marque teach privateers to turn quarrel into enterprise. Corsairs in peacetime become smugglers with a more conversational mission statement. From the east again, friars and envoys walk with matched curiosities. Carpini and Rubruk return from the Great Khan with patient astonishment that tents can administer promises reliably, that a city of felt has pageantry of its own, that law can travel at the speed of a horse and yet arrive on time. Their notes ripen into a European habit of sending questions beyond habitual weather. Answers arrive sewn into fabrics, hammered into blades, copied into books, no longer embarrassed to mention algebra. Beneath the banners of change, the camp remains human. A knight whose grandfather died beneath a Norman kite shield fastens a visor shaped by Milanese hands. An archer whose bow grew in an English hedge feathers shafts with geese raised in Holland. A surgeon who learned vinegar from a nun learns sutures from a Jew, and poultices from a woman the village forgets to name in public, but consults in private. The field becomes a market of manners where courage, newly dressed, keeps the old courtesies. Do not chase too far. Trust the ground, spare the well, count the widows before writing poems. Fortresses, chastened by powder, lower their pride, widen their shoulders, and think in angles the way philosophers think in premises. Towns discover the broad-minded virtues of ditches and the eloquence of bastions that prefer leverage to height. Navies flirt with permanence. Oared galleys continue their ancient errands among islands, while square-sailed hulks move like patient weather systems, bringing warehouses to war. Along every frontier, translation becomes survival. Heralds borrow greetings, quartermasters borrow measures, mothers borrow lullabies. Memory borrows too. Chansons that once guarded identity begin to host admiration for the other. Saladin sketched as courteous, so that knights may compare themselves to someone worthy of comparison. A Mongol scout praised for reading grass. A Moorish mason honoured for persuading lime and sand into solidarity under rain. In these meetings, fear often speaks first, but curiosity waits its turn and stays to help wash the bowls. By the century's close, the furniture of conflict has changed quietly. Pay chests heavier and more regular, engineers confident in their chords and stresses, infantry persuaded that geometry can contradict gallop, captains preferring sieges that end with bread rather than ash. The calendar will soon rename itself, but the habits learned on roads and quays under awnings and at fords keep whispering. Night lifts from harbours and caravanserais like thin steam. Ships breathe, mules crop weeds, a gatekeeper weighs his keys. Far inland, a field that once heard foreign hooves listens only to crickets. What remains from all those crossings, and which parts of it keep walking beside us in quieter shoes, the legacies that still live in our streets and in our ways of deciding? He turns toward now, opening a softer ledger where noise hardens into custom, and custom into the courteous bones of a world. The path ahead smoothing into a calm river of habits carrying lanterns downstream. He walks through the gentler hours of the present and notices how the old campaigns have quietly unpacked their bags in our ordinary rooms, how medieval battles, once loud and particular, have endured as manners and furnishings that seldom raise their voice. In civic squares, the coats of arms have taken off their mail and gone to work as logos, lions and lilies, wheels and keys, still doing the old task of making we legible without requiring a shout. Parade grounds, with their measured steps and right angles, keep a patient memory of pikes in geometry. Drill remains a lullaby for nerves, teaching bodies to borrow steadiness from one another the way lines once did under rain. He hears the cadence of command echoing inside stadiums and marching bands, where timing, formation, flanking and feints are tamed into polite games that keep courage exercised without asking blood to sign the ledger. Bridges repaired before they can become metaphors. This he still sees. Municipalities counting bolts and rivets as if coin had a conscience. The quiet military of maintenance patrolling our mornings. Logistics, that humble sovereign of every campaign, rules warehouses and ports. A supply chain is merely the old baggage train with better shoes, and a quartermaster's spirit lives in anyone who checks the shelf before panic can rehearse its speech. The law too keeps medieval fingerprints, rules of truce and sanctuary transfigured into hospitals where harm stops at the threshold, treaties that protect wells and schools echoing a long education in mercy first spoken by chaplains with oil and calm between lines. Even the word campaign now campaigns for other things, harvests and vaccines, literacy and clean water, the verb keeping its stamina while changing its object. In churches and town halls, remembrance has replaced banners with candles. But the grammar remains, names spoken aloud, stones straightened, music that chooses decency over swagger. In museums, helmets sit like quiet rooms where children try on the sound of responsibility. Mail is admired not for killing but for its patience, rings making treaties with one another until a garment exists that protects more than a single life. Chess continues to teach the courtesy of foresight, fencing the ethics of distance, and the cadet learns the old art of waking early without shouting about it. Town planning knows siege in its bones, boulevards that refuse to be traps, culverts taught to behave during storms, zoning that prevents a city's pantry from becoming hostage to its own traffic. Softer inheritances persist too, a hand raised for parley in a meeting, the good habit of not pursuing a defeated colleague too far, the forgiveness baked into schedules that leave a Sabbath-shaped space where exhaustion is not allowed to legislate. Even the ordinary password on a work computer is cousin to the watchword, an agreement that trust has a door and doors deserve hinges. Heralds survive as diplomats who keep extravagance from turning minutes into disasters. Envoys still memorize distances, only now they measure them in time zones and patience rather than hoofbeats. Engineers who once persuaded walls to stand now teach hospitals to breathe through outages, bridges to flex like well-mannered knees, water to carry kindness toward neighbourhoods history forgot. And in kitchens, the Republic of Boiling continues its quiet campaigns against scarcity, pickling, salting, fermenting, garrisons of winter that hold out without cruelty, writing the oldest mercy in brine and glass. In the countryside, hedgerows, first companions, then confidants of ambush, are green corridors where birds negotiate survival treaties. Farmers rotate fields with the same courtesy their ancestors offered earth, and the land repays by sparing them the need to talk about heroism. Our caution with rumour still owes a debt to old dispatches. The awareness that a single bright lie moves faster than any troop, and that literacy, once a monk's shield for a village's memory, is now a civilian armour against panic. He smiles at the last glimmers of pageantry tucked into graduation robes and mayoral chains. The procession teaches a town to stand together without borrowing fear's vocabulary. In emergencies, volunteers form lines that look very much like old ranks, but the object is water buckets, not spears. The command is not advance, but pass it along. And yet the feeling of belonging to a sentence larger than one's own name keeps the same decent warmth. Listening closely, he hears that the most faithful legacy is not hardware but manners, the instinct to consult the ground before deciding to count the widows, before writing a poem about victory, to fix a bridge so metaphors can keep their appointments. Histories once sung at high volume now hums in design guides and emergency plans. Chivalry, chastened, reappears as kindness that doesn't wait for applause. Strategy returns as the ethics of timing, when to press, when to rest, when to let the harvest speak. Of course, modern life has replaced many tools and unlearned many pains, but the deep choreography remains, softened and humanized. Arrows become emails we are careful not to loose in anger. Sieges become the long patience of reform. Marches become the daily walk toward bread for everyone. And the present, proud of novelty, still argues with itself about which inheritance to keep. Was it the stirrup or the longbow? Did gunpowder end an age, or merely rename it? How often did weather disguise itself as luck? What portion of victory belongs to myth and what to arithmetic? The room of our century grows quiet, ready to host those scholars as they lift lanterns over familiar fields, asking once more the gentle necessary question: what exactly turned those noisy afternoons into the habits by which we hope to live? While outside, in the polite dusk of streetlights and sidewalks, a city practices its unshowy drill of decency, and the night carries its steady lantern down the corridor of tomorrow. He steps into the corridor where mistakes hang like borrowed coats, comfortable, familiar, often worn for warmth rather than accuracy, and he lets each one speak before smoothing its collar and setting it back straighter on the peg. The first wears bright tin and complains of weight. Medieval armour was a prison, it says. A knight toppled like a beetle at the first stone. He smiles, lifts the visor of the claim, and inside finds a room built for breathing. Riveted plates arranged like patient syllables, a moving grammar of hinge and muscle. Men trained to vault into saddles, to run, to kneel. They sweated, yes, but they were not statues. Next, a blade strides forward, too theatrical for its own good, announcing that two-handed swords were anvils brandished by myths. He tests the balance, and the blade answers with a dancer's thrift. 4 pounds of argument, not 40, designed for leverage and timing more than spectacle, the cut learned from practice that valued wrists over roaring. Down the wall, a rumour crooks a finger, boiling oil forever cascading from battlements, yet the ledger of sieges prefers thrift, stones and quarrels, timber and timing, water saved for drinking, sand and quicklime and pitch more common than entire cauldrons, hurled like tantrums. Across from it, a jar of fire boasts about flaming arrows that explode like theatre. The corridor opens a window, and wind scolds the boast. Most flames die mid-flight, unless the day is dry, the pitch stubborn, the geometry lucky, and even then, the lesson is about panic and repair, not fireworks. A larger cloak claims all battles were red, afternoons of constant killing. He turns it inside out and reveals hours of standing still, of bargaining with breath, of small decisive minutes stitched to long stretches of waiting, the arithmetic of fear managed by formation. The next hanger carries a horned helmet and introduces itself as a Viking. The corridor laughs kindly and points the visitor down to the costume department. A softer error clears its throat. People believed the world was flat. The lamps along the wall blink, amused. Sailors did not sail as if falling were expected. Monks copied circles with confidence. Poets rhymed with horizons. Ignorance here is a modern wish for superiority, not their confession. Another misconception drifts like incense, chivalry everywhere, all the time, behaving the way romancers say. He nods at the good days, parleys respected, wells spared, prisoners ransomed. And then he looks to the margins where hunger edits rules, where the barn's mercy is sometimes only a rumour, where courtesy walks with a limp and ordinary kindness keeps showing up anyway, quieter and truer than trumpet virtue. Beside it hangs the reverse error, threadbare from overuse, that medieval armies were mobs without discipline. The floor remembers drill tapped into it like metronome. The air remembers trumpet grammar. He can still hear the quiet economies of alignment, 10 paces, a breath, an angle, saving lives as surely as bravery. Another coat owns a bright badge from Agincourt and insists that arrows alone wrote destiny. He strokes the cloth until terrain, rain, mud, and stakes appear in the weave. And on the far sleeve, the arithmetic of overconfidence mends itself into the pattern. Down the rail, a banner declares that battles were decided by single champions. He lets the chorus correct the solo. Grooms who slept shallow to soothe horses at dawn, quartermasters who counted nails, women who boiled bandages until linen remembered honesty. Victory never fit in one mouth. A hooded figure whispers that plague corpses flew from every trebuchet. He reads the margin note and finds logistics arguing debt and disease travelling on feet more often than on apocrypha, though once in a while a desperate city did try to teach wind to carry spite. A steady cloak, respectable in tone, claims Hastings unbuttoned because of a clever feigned retreat. He turns it over and finds a lining of fatigue, of misunderstanding, of courage that mistook motion for invitation. The gentler truth that days are composed of human margins as much as of stratagems. Another insists that only nobles fought, peasants serving as scenery. The corridor clears its throat with the sound of hundreds of hedges practiced into longbows, of guilds bargaining their courage into city squares, of levies who knew exactly which field their spear had cost at home. Near the end, a small, embarrassed garment admits it has always said women were absent. He finds on its hem the stitches of healers and washers, of peddlers and camp followers, of messengers and makers, unheroic verbs that kept nouns alive. A severe black coat pronounces gunpowder as a single clap ending an age. He touches its cuff and feels centuries of pebbled erosion, angles taught to walls by engineers, bastions learning to think in geometry, captains discovering that patience is also a weapon. Endings, it turns out, prefer paragraphs to gongs. Another mutter tells him every siege starved because angels or demons chose. The pantry in the corner answers with salt, wells, gardens on roofs, and ration ledgers, a theology of boiling and brick, of rope and prudence. One more, kindly but misled, says that medievals did not bathe. Somewhere a bathhouse coughs perfumed steam, rivers remember laughter, and the very sermons that chided excess admit there was enough washing to chide. He lingers longest before a mirror that misinforms by flattery, the enemy as monster. The glass fogs, and with a clean sleeve he finds a face like anyone's, hungry, proud, hopeful, frightened, sometimes courteous, sometimes cruel, often both before night. This is the error he corrects most carefully, because it tends to return wearing newer fashion. When he has walked the corridor once, he walks it again, and the coats look lighter, less certain of their own dramatics, more willing to be folded. He notices how correction works best, when it behaves like housekeeping, dust taken off a cherished thing so it can be loved more accurately, elbows on table, not fists, evidence brought like bread. He thinks of teachers who carry patience the way standard bearers carry cloth, visible but not invulnerable, of footnotes that shake hands with opposing sources, of documentaries that choose a quiet camera over a sneer. What remains after the touchings up is not a museum of scolding, but a wardrobe fit for honest walking, armour that articulates, swords that weigh no more than responsibility, bows that ask for practice as well as romance, wells protected by law and by decency, numbers that confess uncertainty without collapsing into shrug. Outside the study door, the hallway of our own feeds and headlines waits with its fast shoes. He ties the laces of his skepticism carefully and promises to carry the better habits along. Ask for the ground, ask for the weather, ask who counted the widows, ask who washed the bandages, ask where the water came from. The lamps along the wall let out their mild gold. The pages ahead breathe, and he steps toward the next room, where a long, sleep-friendly map waits for a finger to trace the quiet routes by which all these lessons travelled into our present manners, turning noise into custom, custom into the daily eloquence of repair. He walks the hallway where familiar mistakes nap like old cats and, with the patience of a kindly librarian, brushes each one until its real face comes forward, less theatrical than rumour, far more human than slogans. The first error gleams in a mirror of polished steel, insisting that a fully armoured fighter shuffled like a statue. He smiles and asks the harness to move, and it does, with the articulate ease of something jointed by craft and rehearsed by breath. Step, turn, lift, breathe, until balance remembers itself. Nearby, a sword sulks as heavy as a door in a child's imagination. On a calm scale, it admits 2 or 3 honest pounds more often than 5, a companion for long hours, not a stunt for 10 seconds. The battlefield of hearsay is always chaos. The fields of the time were scored to a modest music. Stakes counted, distances memorized like prayers, scouts and signals knitting intention from dust. A cartwheel of flaming arrows crackles for attention. He tips a bucket of facts and the sparks go out. Fire loves roofs and granaries, while arrows love speed and accuracy. Pitch and flame had their appropriated moments, yes, but most shafts travelled with quieter arguments, bodkins disputing with mail, broadheads composing brief letters to unarmoured haste. A pot claims it poured boiling oil as a daily rite. He peels off the label and reads an older kitchen, water, sand, stones, quicklime, whatever a pantry's courage could afford. Oil, precious, usually stayed where dinners were saved and lamps kept promises. Another door complains that battles decided everything in a single noon. He gestures to the ledger in the calendar. Campaigns took seasons, consequences took years, and treaties walked on many afternoons of patience. Even victories behaved like weather, arriving, lingering, then being revised by harvests and births. A tapestry across the way tries to knight everyone on a shining horse. He points instead to spears and pikes and billhooks, to footmen whose steadiness wrote longer sentences, and to horses valued and spared when fields turned mean. In a bright corner, a pulpit declares that a command from on high made certain weapons sinful. He reads the footnotes gently. The crossbow invited moral discomfort, to be sure, but princes bought competence when conscience argued longer than hunger could bear. Edicts flickered, practice persisted, and the sin most often punished was starvation, not string and nut. He straightens another frame. Chivalry governed, much like a stern schoolmaster, tutoring manners, ransoms instead of erasures, wells spared when memory behaved. But terror could overrule poetry, and mercy always arrived as a choice, never a law of physics. In the next alcove, a tired insult mumbles that peasants were expendable shades. He draws the curtain to show names stitched into tunics, rent paid by calloused hands, levies that returned to harvest if leadership remembered its arithmetic. These were neighbours, not numbers, and their quiet crafts, digging, mending, carrying, often saved more lives than silver trumpets. Another corner supposes women were absent. He lifts the ledgers and bandages where bakers lengthened courage with bread, healers disciplined fever, quartermasters arithmetic kept afternoons possible, and widows negotiated truces the way mills negotiate rivers. Beneath a lamp, a page pretends armour was uniform and choir bright. He folds it back to reveal the thrift of mixed pieces, repairs that remembered last year's bruise, gambesons patched with household sanity. Farther on, a smug chart sneers that maps were ignorant and men walked under a sky of superstition. He lays beside it itineraries, coastal pilots, star-reading traditions, and admits that even now we mishear weather. Humility is better company than mockery. When he comes to the hinge named gunpowder, he asks us to hear it properly. Not a door slammed in a single echo, but a latch lifted slowly, engineers counting angles, walls changing their silhouettes, towns learning to think in ditches and depth. In a glass case, a legend assures that all myths lied. He cracks it open to let air in. Stories bend light to carry meaning across winters. They decorated, yes, but they also preserved the feel of steadiness in rain. Another correction stands. Not every visor crowned a noble brow. Not every bow grew from the same hedge. Trade and borrowing made cousins of strangers. A Milanese plate could sit over English vowels, and geese from Dutch marshes might feather a quiver that spoke French. Around the last bend the old accusation waits that the era was merely dark. He dims the lantern on purpose and brightens it to show monasteries counting carefully, towns inventing guild courtesies, engineers translating impatience into bridges, mothers teaching calories to last until light returned. Darkness, he suggests, is often a mood mistaken for a measurement. He gathers a few final misunderstandings with the same friendly diligence. No, battles were not a daily habit in every shire. Most lives were built from sewing, sorting, and keeping hinges quiet. No, every standard did not always fly where the chronicle swears. Dust and wind do misfile memories. No, every charge was not trumpet-blown destiny. Many were simple practicalities fitted to a lane, abandoned when mud revised the sentence. And the gentlest correction of all, enemies were not always monsters. Letters crossed the lines, ransoms were kept. A stranger's courtesy could teach a local custom its best behaviour. He closes the gallery softly. These debunkings do not scold. They lower the volume so truer sounds emerge, leather easing on a useful strap, a quartermaster's pencil breathing numbers into fairness, an archer's string telling the wind a civil truth. In that quieter room, the age becomes legible without forfeiting wonder. He lingers because just beyond this corridor, a door stands ajar and laughter spills through. Bards and painters and filmmakers arranging these fields in brighter colours, sometimes faithful, sometimes fondly wrong, always leaving footprints in modern dust. He turns toward that little theatre where memory wears makeup and props learn to speak, curious which fictions keep the heart honest and which deserve a gentle unmasking. While outside the tent, the night leans its ear, and a lantern draws a small amber circle that invites the next story to sit down. He walks the hallway where familiar mistakes nap like old cats and, with the patience of a kindly librarian, brushes each one until its real face comes forward, less theatrical than rumour, far more human than slogans. The first error gleams in a mirror of polished steel, insisting that a fully armoured fighter shuffled like a statue. He smiles and asks the harness to move, and it does, with the articulate ease of something jointed by craft and rehearsed by breath, step, turn, lift, breathe, until balance remembers itself. Nearby, a sword sulks as heavy as a door in a child's imagination. On a calm scale, it admits 2 or 3 honest pounds more often than 5. A companion for long hours, not a stunt for 10 seconds. The battlefield of hearsay is always chaos. The fields of the time were scored to a modest music, stakes counted, distances memorized like prayers, scouts and signals knitting intention from dust. A cartwheel of flaming arrows crackles for attention. He tips a bucket of facts and the sparks go out. Fire loves roofs and granaries, while arrows love speed and accuracy. Pitch and flame had their appropriated moments, yes, but most shafts travelled with quieter arguments, bodkins disputing with mail, broadheads composing brief letters to unarmoured haste. A pot claims it poured boiling oil as a daily rite. He peels off the label and reads an older kitchen. Water, sand, stones, quicklime, whatever a pantry's courage could afford. Oil, precious, usually stayed where dinners were saved, and lamps kept promises. Another door complains that battles decided everything in a single noon. He gestures to the ledger and the calendar. Campaigns took seasons, consequences took years, and treaties walked on many afternoons of patience. Even victories behaved like weather, arriving, lingering, then being revised by harvests and births. A tapestry across the way tries to knight everyone on a shining horse. He points instead to spears and pikes and billhooks, to footmen whose steadiness wrote longer sentences, and to horses valued and spared when fields turned mean. In a bright corner, a pulpit declares that a command from on high made certain weapons sinful. He reads the footnotes gently. The crossbow invited moral discomfort, to be sure, but princes bought competence when conscience argued longer than hunger could bear. Edicts flickered, practice persisted, and the sin most often punished was starvation, not string and nut. He straightens another frame, chivalry governed, much like a stern schoolmaster, tutoring, manners, ransoms instead of erasures, wells spared when memory behaved. But terror could overrule poetry, and mercy always arrived as a choice, never a law of physics. In the next alcove, a tired insult mumbles that peasants were expendable shades. He draws the curtain to show names stitched into tunics, rent paid by calloused hands, levies that returned to harvest if leadership remembered its arithmetic. These were neighbours, not numbers, and their quiet crafts, digging, mending, carrying, often saved more lives than silver trumpets. Another corner supposes women were absent. He lifts the ledgers and bandages where bakers lengthened courage with bread, healers disciplined fever, quartermasters arithmetic kept afternoons possible, and widows negotiated truces the way mills negotiate rivers. Beneath a lamp, a page pretends armour was uniform and choir bright. He folds it back to reveal the thrift of mixed pieces, repairs that remembered last year's bruise, gambesons patched with household sanity. Farther on, a smug chart sneers that maps were ignorant and men walked under a sky of superstition. He lays beside it itineraries, coastal pilots, star-reading traditions, and admits that even now we mishear weather. Humility is better company than mockery. When he comes to the hinge, named gunpowder, he asks us to hear it properly. Not a door slammed in a single echo, but a latch lifted slowly, engineers counting angles, walls changing their silhouettes, towns learning to think in ditches and depth. In a glass case, a legend assures that all myths lied. He cracks it open to let air in. Stories bend light to carry meaning across winters. They decorated, yes, but they also preserved the feel of steadiness in rain. Another correction stands. Not every visor crowned a noble brow. Not every bow grew from the same hedge. Trade and borrowing made cousins of strangers. A Milanese plate could sit over English vowels, and geese from Dutch marshes might feather a quiver that spoke French. Around the last bend the old accusation waits, that the era was merely dark. He dims the lantern on purpose and brightens it to show monasteries counting carefully, towns inventing guild courtesies, engineers translating impatience into bridges, mothers teaching calories to last until light returned. Darkness, he suggests, is often a mood mistaken for a measurement. He gathers a few final misunderstandings with the same friendly diligence. No, battles were not a daily habit in every shire. Most lives were built from sewing, sorting, and keeping hinges quiet. No, every standard did not always fly where the chronicle swears. Dust and wind do misfile memories. No, every charge was not trumpet-blown destiny. Many were simple practicalities fitted to a lane, abandoned when mud revised the sentence. And the gentlest correction of all, enemies were not always monsters. Letters crossed the lines. Ransoms were kept. A stranger's courtesy could teach a local custom its best behaviour. He closes the gallery softly. These debunkings do not scold. They lower the volume so truer sounds emerge. Leather easing on a useful strap, a quartermaster's pencil breathing numbers into fairness, an archer's string telling the wind a civil truth. In that quieter room, the age becomes legible, without forfeiting wonder. He lingers because just beyond this corridor, a door stands ajar and laughter spills through. Bards and painters and filmmakers arranging these fields in brighter colours, sometimes faithful, sometimes fondly wrong, always leaving footprints in modern dust. He turns toward that little theatre where memory wears makeup and props learn to speak, curious which fictions keep the heart honest and which deserve a gentle unmasking, while outside the tent the night leans its ear and a lantern draws a small amber circle that invites the next story to sit down. Night has come to that tender hour when streets learn to whisper and windows ferry their small moons from room to room. And after so many miles together, it feels honest to ease our stride, to let the fields and fords compose their own last sentence while we listen. He remembers the quiet companions of our way, hedgerows that tutored patience, bells that measured courage into humane portions, bridges repaired before they needed metaphors, spoons that turned siege into soup, standards folded so the wind would not have to scold, and understands that the oldest instruction is also the gentlest. Endure without hardening. The afternoons of medieval noise leave behind furniture for ordinary rooms, the habit of asking the ground its opinion before deciding, the courtesy of leaving wells clean, the discipline of counting widows before writing poems about victory, the thrift of mending straps at dusk, so tomorrow wakes to fewer emergencies. He remembers armour moving like a hymn learned by muscle, bows speaking the grammar of distance, engineers kneeling to earth with more reverence than to princes, quartermasters preaching the unromantic gospel of enough. He remembers women making vinegar into mercy and linen into promises that held, and men discovering, sometimes late, yet not too late, that restraint is a bravery fit for neighbours who must share the morning. He remembers myths that bent light without breaking truth, and scholars who polished doubt until it shone like a kindness. Above all, he remembers the people who never entered the lines of chronicles but kept the lines upon fields, grooms breathing at a horse's pace, bakers lengthening courage with bread, smiths listening for the right colour in a blade, children learning the etiquette of quiet around fire and water. And the land, older than any banner, kept speaking, ridges lending breath, marshes correcting pride, rivers announcing schedules no rhetoric could amend, until commanders learned to translate weather into mercy. From such conversations, something recognisably human persisted. The soft politics of repair, the parish science of survival, the town's patient trust in hinges, culverts, and fairness. Perhaps that is the inheritance that travels well into late kitchens and busy streets, arranging our days like steady formations that keep panic from spending us too quickly. Practicing truces inside the calendar so harvests of rest can happen. Carrying passwords that sound like kindness. Mistrusting any glory that cannot pass a ledger. He sets a last handful of images on the table where the lamp is kind, a chaplain wiping fog from a face so the man can recognize himself, a surgeon humming a psalm whose meter keeps his hands careful, a scout returning with mud that has already written tomorrow's choice, a mason tapping a brace into a tired arch and listening for the clean echo, a mother dividing a fig so exactly that both halves feel chosen. The noise ebbs, and what remains is workable. Courage prefers company. Discipline protects tenderness. The best victories come home, able to apologise when needed and to boil water without theatrics. If there is a prayer hidden in these miles, it is small and serviceable. May we be good neighbours to the ground and to one another. May our bridges hold. May our wells remember us kindly. May our banners, when they rise, ask less for spectacle than for visibility. He waits for the last bell and hears instead a quieter music, the ledger closing with a soft workmanlike sigh, the coin in the pay chest lying down like a small moon choosing sleep, the quiver empty, not from rage, but from careful use. The rope coiled, the way trust is coiled when a day has behaved. Outside, the ridge pulls on its shawl of dark. The stream forgives footprints, and the road decides to be only a road again. He stands, touches the laurel by the door, a little chlorophyll prayer, and lets the house learn his unhurried pace. Thank you for keeping company through these 20 nights, for walking the slow lanes where dust becomes history and history becomes manners. Thank you for the quiet of your listening, which made room for bridges and bread to speak. Now the hour is kind to sleep. Lay the standard gently where it can dream of wind without needing to fight it. Set the cup so its handle faces outward for whoever may arrive. Close your eyes like gates that know their watchword, and if the night is willing, it will lend you a field without fear, a bell that keeps a courteous time, and the small, steady feeling that you are travelling with good companions until morning chooses its light, and somewhere beyond the hedges of memory, another patient story begins.